All right, I'm here with Sam Shethar. Mr. Shethar is an educator. He is a competitive lifter. He is a self-help aficionado, a 600-pound bencher, and he's here to share some of his secrets with us. Mr. Shethar, how are you doing today, sir?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great, thank you. I'm just trying to get that last bit of caffeine in to get this and then the rest of my day going. Getting the gears going is a little tricky at first, but this is one of the best ways to start it, with some in-depth discussion about training and life stuff. So I'm really eager to pick your brain. I want to get right into it. You just hit a 600-pound bench recently, which that in any body, in any nation, is a world-class feat. I'm afraid to ask what you weigh because it's going to make me feel bad, but you're easily under 250, right?
No, sir. No, sir. I weighed 270 the morning of the bench press because I pushed my body weight up pretty hard for that as part of. I was just trying to leverage everything I could because I felt like I was within like general striking range. And everybody knows you bench more when you're a bloated mess. So I took advantage of that.
Yeah, that's the underside of manipulating your strength. I think a lot of people don't know about because they're so fixated on the long game. But there is so much short term that you can really pull out of your body if you really just commit to driving that weight forward.
The problem though is that people really chronically rely on that. Like I'm sure you've met a lot of guys, especially in strongman and super heavyweight untested powerlifting, that like they can't train to save their life, they can't program to save their life, but they're kind of have this massive band-aid of all times, which is just a year-round caloric surplus. Because it's like, yeah, pushing your calories through like a really intense phase of training, like it does spike your ability to handle that volume and make adaptations, and you can push like I think just probably that intramuscular water retention when we push a bunch of carbs, push a bunch of sodium, come in like a water balloon. Most guys observe their benches a little bit more. It's probably not the best competitive package for like a strength sport like strongman, but for benching, it works really good. But the problem is if you do that every single week on your Monday bench day, right? You just climb and climb and climb, and like your dots goes down. You become probably worse as an athlete competitively, but it works if you're just trying to be the strongest bencher at your YMCA. Like you can use that chronic caloric surplus. So it's like something I try to use in moderation. But it was like I knew when I hit 565 on the bench to pins, and I was like, I'm close enough that I could like take all of my training economy and leverage it towards one thing instead of trying to stay well-rounded and make that push and span a bunch of distance really quickly. But I knew like the biggest thing and always my biggest struggle is getting my body weight up because I started the prep for the bench at like 250 and then I ended it at 270. Not probably genuine 20 pounds of weight gain, probably 10 of that's water minimum, but that was like a big part of the strategy, but it was like a short-term push and I'm already back down to like 253 right now.
And there's a lot of good things to pull out of that. I mean, one is it just highlights the obvious relationship between mass and strength. I mean, beyond just muscularity, but also just being in a super saturated state, because people really underestimate how much strength does rely on how full you are, how topped off you are. So no matter how strong you could be in any particular scenario, if you're more fed and more hydrated and more bloated, you're stronger, period. And a lot of guys try to chase this long-term package where they just want to be really muscular and look like a bodybuilder, and I'm trying to do 5 different things at once. And you need those periods where your body is topped off enough to where you can chase those numbers to really push the limits. On the strongman note, and that's what I was going to bring up actually, because it's really evident in that sport. Because one, the guys don't generally have to do weight classes. There's weight class competitors, but if you look at the open guys, which there's guys that weigh 270, there's guys that weigh 450, especially going back and forth between the world's strongest man, which is typically lighter, faster, more capacity based, and going into the Arnold, which was just heavy as balls. I mean, you go from like foot races with 700-pound yokes where people are fighting for fractions of a second, or like god-awful endurance medleys with kegs where you're like walking through sand and water that just blows you out. And then like so many months later, you're on the stage at the Arnold, which is only like 30 feet across, and you're carrying like a 1,500-pound yoke like 10 feet. So
the old nerve damage yoke.
Oh my God. Yeah. Like just, you're never going to be right after this yoke. Like you're going to feel me when you're old and gray. And the way the guys would get ready for that is they would bulk up. So you would see 30, 40-pound spreads in their body weight between getting ready for Worlds and getting ready for the Arnold. And you would see their static numbers climb up predictably as a result.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the biggest thing that we need to take away, though, right? Is that it's not like a year round, like you always say, like there's knobs you can turn. It's not something you're constantly turning, even though it works, which is really tempting, right? It's like the same guys that are attracted to basically running a peaking phase year round because they're like, ah, man, if I touch a heavy single weekly, I see this fast adaptation, and it's like that's only possible because it was preceded by whatever amount of volume you were doing and whatever base you built up, right? So it's in the short term, this is effective training. But this idea is you just keep turning the knob and turning the knob and turning the knob, and it stops becoming effective training. I think it's the same thing with the caloric surplus, where it's like, yeah, at some point you're going to become metabolically obese. And frankly, I think the biggest thing, like I've heard a lot of guys push back recently on this idea of like improved nutrient partitioning when you're leaner. Like what weight you gain when you're leaner is more likely to be muscle than weight you gain when you're heavier. Not saying that it isn't true, but hey, where is like the quintessential like cornerstone studies when we're saying this as a fact? And I was like, wait a minute. I've always just accepted that because it made sense. But I think part of that also is just the fact that once you get past a certain point of body weight gain, your ability to handle high volumes of training and honestly just train hard goes down the shitter. I've passed that point. You've passed that point. Anybody who's trained for maximal strength has passed that point where you're like, body weight good, body weight good. And it's just like, wow, I can't fucking train properly. I actually am a little bit stronger, just a little bit lighter. And that's why, like, one of many reasons you can't turn that dial year round. And also, no man is an island. Nobody likes looking like shit. And eventually, if you associate strength sports with looking like shit, eventually you might come to sour on the sport itself, right? So it's like maybe we could take a little bit slower approach and not hate how we look, and have this be a long-term thing, because everybody that knows their stuff will tell you this is a uniquely long-term endeavor, right? It's like if you're a good sprinter, you show promise within the first year. There's good lifters that look like nothing special within the first year. You know, like my numbers were nothing to like write home about. I think obviously I've got great genetics. I don't think I'm going to be super arrogant and tell you I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and have average genetics, but nothing about my start point nor my year one check-in was like outstanding. It's like a uniquely long endeavor.
I'm right there with you, man. I feel like I'm in a rare spot because of how long it took me to. I mean, I'm over 20 years of training. I'm near 20 years competing, and I'm still getting better. And a lot of that, and this is what I think of when I look at people who talk about potential, because when you talk about natty limits or human limits or reaching whatever you think your ceiling is, it assumes that you've done everything you could do the entire time, which doesn't exist in any capacity. And I can look back at the runs I had of shitty training, and I'm a guy that never missed a week for like 20 years straight. Like I had goals. I wanted to do some things. And there were still runs of like experimenting. You need to experiment enough to find new things, but not so much that you screw yourself up. So anyways, there's a lot that goes into that. But yeah, I think absolutely you can do this long run if you're intelligent and you experiment. You mentioned the Band-Aid thing, which seems to be a theme, because when people are eager, especially when they're new, and instead of doing newbie things that are appropriate for people that are untrained, they do the elite things because that's what they see on their feed. Like, I want to train like my favorite lifter, not understanding that that's on the back end of years of dedicated training for them and evolving their training as they went. You end up doing things like peaking, and you're like, oh my God, if I stop doing a lot of work and I just go really heavy, like once a week, I get strong as shit. And I remember figuring that out when I was like 17, after like 5 or 6 years of doing stuff out of like Arnold's Bodybuilding Encyclopedia. I'm like, oh my God, I can do like 2 triples on 3 lifts. And then I got so strong so fast. Fast forward 4 or 5 years, and I was a lot stronger, but I was just like you said, I looked like shit. I had no capacity. I didn't do better in strongman as a result, even though my static lifts were up. Conditioning was down. I always took that to think like, wow, if recovery is so important, the ultimate power lifter is going to be somebody that gets wheeled around in a chair unless they're actively squatting, right? And they're just going to be like foie gras, just being force fed and permanent recovery until it's time to train. And you realize that the counterbalance exists everywhere. You have to be able to be conditioned to train, which is why GPP is a thing. And you have to be lean enough to function and not be a slob. So actually, on that note, because I do want to get back to benching, but so what do you think of the guys that did take that and ran to the nth degree? Because you have guys like Glenn Ross is the perennial example all these years later, because he was a bodybuilder and he went like J.M. Blakely, C.T. Fletcher, dirty bulk permanently and was competitive. And then today you have guys like Andrew Richard, who's same thing, went on like a 200-pound bulk journey and is overhead pressing 500 pounds plus, but is also, you know, morbidly obese. What's your take on that trend of people just trying to run to the end at all costs?
So as a spectator, I think it's fucking cool, to be perfectly honest. I like seeing like just how far people can take things, right? I think as influence on young trainees, it's probably not the greatest, right? Because frankly, just about everybody is not going to be limited by their genetics. They're going to be limited by how long they stick with this, right? Like you're the rare case of someone who's done this for their whole life and doesn't plan on stopping. Most people, the reason their powerlifting total stops is because they stop powerlifting, right? There's more beginners than there are intermediates, and there's more intermediates than there are advanced lifters. That's just the nature of the beast, right? So it's like if we're promoting effective training practices, things that are going to keep people in the gym is very, 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 very high on my list of priorities, right? And so it's like, yes, we can get wicked strong, getting really fat. And I've worked with some guys who took that approach. You know, they decided that's what they're going to do. My job is to help them. And I actually coached a guy who squatted 850 when he was 17 in reps, just bloat maxed up, right? Like giant kid, right? But all the potential in the world, like everything about that guy would scream, hey, give me 5 more years. Let me kind of learn what nutrition looks like. Let me learn what effective training looks like. Let me refine my technique. And I'm a top 5 guy in the world minimum. But the problem is that he just came to associate getting strong with hating how he looks and force feeding and just these habits that is like, I also think there's a big difference between a guy who is choosing to be morbidly obese for the pursuit of strength or a guy who would be morbidly obese whether he was training or not, right? I think there's a very big difference mentally between those two athletes. Like my brother is a super heavyweight powerlifter, and I can say, hand on my heart, yeah, he definitely would not be 330 some pounds if he wasn't training. He'd probably be about 220 pounds. And he's just force feeding primarily clean food, whatever we want to term clean, right? Like yada, yada, yada. But I think there's a big difference between that or someone who got into the sport while already quite heavy. They're going to like it because they're going to be stronger. There's no dots calculator sitting in the YMCA. They get to feel as though they're initially really, really good at it, right? If we're just comparing gym lifts to gym lifts, they are, right? That's why they probably hate dots a little bit for saying like, hey, let's scale this relative to the best people in your class, right? I guess I'm rambling a little bit. I like watching it. I don't recommend that people do it because I think even the guys that tell them rah, rah, I hate myself, like I wish I had a girlfriend, I'll just get morbidly obese and wicked strong. You can tell yourself you don't care how you look. I know very, very few people that 5 years from then don't like, oh God, I got to cut down. And then they're devastated when they realize just how tied to their strength, their weight is, and their strength plummets because they were using that weight gain and that heavy caloric surplus as a band-aid for the fact that they really didn't know how to train all that effectively. And then they're devastated. They're like, oh, I just got a bunch of fat. I'll just keep my muscle. I'll trim off the fat. It's like, God damn, I wish it worked that way. But you're going to come down, you're going to lose a lot of strength, and it's going to take you a couple of years to become good in that weight class you cut down to, which is no fun. And let's just skip that process. Like it's probably a bad call for most lifters, but I think for the rare person that can handle the kind of strain that comes with that mentally, I mean, I like watching it. You know, Andrew Richard's a freak.
I'm right there with you, and that's an interesting balance that doesn't get discussed because people are usually on one side of the spectrum of responsible role modeling versus people can do what they want. Nobody's obligated to, you know, cater to the masses or be responsible for that. I think it's an important thing to say some things are appropriate for certain groups of people, and we can allow for that, engage with it, even enjoy it, while still having a responsible discussion that says, hey, if you want to go that route, here's all the risks you're taking. This ain't for everybody. And it seems like we're collectively kind of dumb at having that conversation. There's a lot of parallels that I've drawn to PEDs. Like I decided to take the path of being open because I thought it was responsible. I thought I had earned the right to try to compete at the highest levels after 15 years of training without it. And I thought that was just the most like principled approach to try to educate people or whatever. You get pushback any which way. But similarly, if you have people that are like I hate to use the word glorifying. Like anytime you do something with passion, you're like convincing the rest of the world to do exactly what you did. But if you are in a position where you're glorifying something unhealthy or that does have a huge cost, and getting morbidly obese does have a huge cost, there's risk associated with it. But we should be able to enjoy the spectacles of the people that voluntarily choose to borderline kill themselves for greatness, whatever that means to them, while still recognizing that the influence on what you disseminate to other people, like, it's not one size fits all. And the higher you climb that mountain, the more true that is. For the thing about appearance, and I want to talk a little bit later about this, but that's a really interesting point, because it's so more complex than you would think, the relationship between physical appearance, both how other people see you and how you see yourself, and your relationship with other people. And you talking about that, the people like, oh, like, I'm just gonna get fat as shit and strong as shit because screw it, you know, I'm MGTOW now or whatever. Like, I'm just on my own, going full bloat max. It's like, on the one hand, like, that's true. People are very attached to their looks, whether they admit to it or not, and that's not a bad thing. It's an expression of how you tend to live your life that gets sent to other people. I always say that it's like, people aren't happy because they're going from 10% to 8% body fat. They're happy because they went from being really just chaotic and reckless with their eating in their life to having a semblance of control, and that bleeds through everything you do. On the other hand, though, there's so many things that can attract a potential mate. And I always call back to, he was like a brother to me, one of my best friends. Shout out to Brent Lewis Henderson. But he was in excess of 400 pounds when I met him. We were teenagers working at a grocery store. And pardon my French, but he pulled bitches. And I have so many examples of that throughout my life, where seeing people that did not have the typical cut that you think is like, that's what women want, and seeing people that blow that out of the water because they were able to leverage something else that was so much more important. So that's a little tangent there, but that's what made me think of that.
I think that's where a lot of guys go wrong, though, is they think that the primary reason that they should be getting in shape is because that's going to make up for like whatever flaws with their personality is the reason that they're not talking to people right now. And it's like, that's not it. But that's also not the reason you should do it, right? Like, yes, getting jacked is not the most profound way to get attention from women, but that's also probably not the reason. Like, that's just because that's not the reason to do it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, right? Like, taking care of yourself physically, your image of yourself, regardless of how other people perceive it, you know, so like self-improvement type mumbo jumbo at the end of the day. But it's like, yeah, you should be doing it because you like the effect it has on you, not because you like how it affects other people's perceptions of you. Potentially, probably in an ideal world, it affects both. But at the end of the day, right, like, you're only going to stick with things that hold meaning to you usually.
That's absolutely true. And I think you have to feel it in your bones. I've been saying that a lot lately, because there's different types of wants that people have. Everybody wants something. If it's a genie granting them a wish. So
speaking of feel it about your bones, we should talk about benching.
There we go. There we go. Yeah, you're bringing us back on track. I want to know. I want to know what your journey was like to the 600-pound bench, because you talked about bloating, getting up to it. Did you run into any obstacles on that run up?
The push from 565 to 600, or like the lifetime body of work?
Well, both. I mean, you did a short-term skirmish where you realized you had this little bit of strength that you could push through to, but also it was a very long run. So, I mean, give us both views.
Yeah, so I mean, like, really zoomed out. Before I started lifting weights, I did a ton of calisthenics because I was boxing at the time, and that was just like, that was our general physical training. My coach was very anti-weights. It's going to slow you down, make you muscle bound, so we're going to do like tons of push-ups and dips and pull-ups. So when I got in the gym, doing tons of volumes of push-ups, dips, and pull-ups, potentiated some like early success. I didn't start out like throwing up 2 plates. Like, you hear lots of guys say like, oh, the first time I got on the bench press, I did 3 plates. It's like, A, a lot of the time I don't believe you. B, like, some people for sure, I've seen it, but I think a lot of people also fib about that to kind of create the mystique of, oh, I'm genetically elite, when a lot of the time the start point didn't look extraordinary. The initial rate of progression is what looked extraordinary, and they just like to ham it up and create this mythos, right? You know, I think I benched 1 plate the first time, which is ahead of a lot of people the first time they get in the gym, but nothing to write home about. I was a really skinny guy. I was like 145. Saw really good progression up to, let's say, like low to mid 200s. with minimal planning. Just like I came up with this idea that on my primary bench day, I would do a 5x5. And then my secondary bench day, I would fill in some volume and do a bunch of sets of 10. Looking back, it was a pretty good idea. And I also thankfully understood pretty early on, because I think that was the influences of the time, that the biggest difference between me and the guys that were way stronger than me was mostly just that they had a ton of muscle and that I didn't. So I kind of early on, I was just like, that's the biggest difference between me and them. I need to be learning from bodybuilders about nutrition. How do I put on muscle, right? Because I don't know, I was a skinny guy. I didn't have any reason to believe my genetics were good, even though they were. Like, I was always strong for a skinny guy. I always punched hard in boxing, and like I would always win arm wrestling, but nothing to suggest like, oh, strength athlete in the making. But I saw Dan Green, and my arrogant little ass was like, I don't see any reason I couldn't do that. If I get that big, I'll be that strong probably. So I just started doing like tons of bodybuilding assistance work, have a heavy day, a light day, took me up to the mid twos, kind of revamped my approach a little bit, where I started trying out small up junior on the bench, which I remember that was a big ask at that point. I wasn't very technically efficient. So bench pressing actually probably beat me up more then than it does now, even with that, like I'm lifting twice as much weight, if not more. Just that difference in mechanical efficiency and just that lifetime of adaptations to this specific movement pattern. So I remember that was like asking a lot of me, but it worked really well. I think I ran it over and over and over the course of a while. And that took me, I think, to 330. And then around that 330 mark, I hit a bit of a plateau where I kind of had to come up with like actually my own approach to programming. And honestly, that's where I came to the approach that I use now, right? Because I think there's this question. That's the reason I love your channel, is because you're constantly touching upon this weird transition point where you're like, lifting is so simple. You just pick a fixed rep and set scheme, and then you add weight every week. And then suddenly that stops working. And it's just this earth-shattering moment. You're like, man, I hit my genetic limit, I guess. And it's like, really, we have to figure out, okay, well, what can we do to solve this problem of, I can't just keep the reps and sets static, and I can't just add weight each week. I probably need to begin periodizing, whether we go like a conjugate route, whether we go like a more of a block periodization route. And I remember around that time, I watched an Ed Cohn interview where he's just like, I just do a 10-week training cycle. I start at 60% and I do a bunch of reps, and then I try to end at 101%, and the volume comes down. It's like, and then as long as I'm stronger on week 7 than last week 7, I was like, oh, okay. So if I can't be stronger this week than I was last week, I'll go week 7 to week 7, right? And I just got a notebook, and I was like, oh, like, yeah, cool. I'm lifting more on week 7 than last week 7. That's the solution, right? Thankfully, I think that was a pretty good idea. I think I mostly stumbled into it, but it sounded like profoundly logical to me. So I started this idea of, okay, 10-week training cycles. I'm going to try to PR every 10 weeks now. And I would build as much volume starting at about 55 to 60% as I can, take these standard jumps out. I would just calculate like, okay, well, I need like 2.5% jumps per session, climb my way to 101%. That paired with, I started pausing all of my volume work. And that took me from around 330, kind of hard stuck there, to, I want to say about 405. I had a little bit of a hang up at 385, and I kind of addressed that through mostly just kind of progressing my nutrition to understand that meal frequency was a big deal for me. I don't have a big appetite. I don't really enjoy food that much. And I also have IBS. So my nutrition's always been like very traditional, like bodybuilding clean food, mostly because that's all I can eat that doesn't upset my stomach. And I don't really feel like I'm missing out on much. So I never really had the ability to like dirty bulk. So I was only able to eat so much like beef and rice in one sitting. I've kind of adopted the vertical diet around this time. I could only eat so much in one sitting. And I kind of found out that it's like, if I'm going to push my body weight up, which I know I need to be eating 5 meals a day minimum, right? It's just, if I don't sit down and eat till I can't eat much more, 5 times per day, then my body weight will not go up. And I've always been like a really single track minded person. Like, I've never been to a party. I've never drank. Like, I think it's important, I guess, to like, the second I walked into a gym, my whole day was like drinking protein shakes, and I was like eating tuna at the back of class. And I was just this weird dude that only talked about lifting weights. And I have been ever since. And that just spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. And then in college, I think I went my entire freshman year without ever making a single friend. And I didn't even think anything was wrong, because I'm like, fuck yeah, this college gym facility is awesome. And I'm able to dial in my nutrition way more at this dining hall than I was able to at home. And because like my parents didn't have a ton of money back then, so we didn't have a bunch of like lean beef sitting around. So I was like, the dining hall is awesome. So I like kind of refined my nutrition, like kind of just stayed in my own world, made it to about 405. Then again, I kind of had to revamp things where I did a lot of research and I kind of restructured my general bodybuilding training that was kind of going on in the background, as well as really double downing on the food, because I was probably about 195 pounds when I did my first 405 bench. And things were going like tremendously well. But I knew that like, yeah, the difference between me and somebody who does 500 is I'm skinny and they're not skinny. I really need to work on that. So I just was eating until I was one bite away from puking 5 times a day at the dining hall, every single day, like clockwork. And my girlfriend can attest, because I met her a little bit after this. I would regularly just like, I ate one bite too many. I would walk outside the dining hall. I would throw up and I would come back in and I would just load up a new plate of food and I would eat it. And I never really thought it was like, oh, I'm so hardcore, I'm eating. I was like, this is what's supposed to be done. Made the push. I think I got up to 440. And then things really started actually going pretty smooth, because around that 420 to 450 mark, I really revamped my technique to stop being complete dog shit, and really found out how to create a lot more stability through my upper back. Kind of understood that it's not just scaps back, it's scaps back and down. And that down component is probably more important than the back component, because you always hear the scaps back if your shoulders are hurting when you're first starting. And I never really understood this idea of scapular depression. And I also started to really understand that if you're not very uncomfortable when you're benching, you're bad at benching, right? So it's like I got better and better at jamming myself into this position, creating the scapular tightness, pulling in a maximal amount of air. Was something that I kind of came up with around this time before I come under, because I realized I could get more air before I unrack the weight. And then I would do, if it was a single, I would always do it with that breath I took before I unracked it. And then that just kind of comboed with me being really obsessive about it. I think I got 455, and I remember things were firing on all cylinders, and I really felt like I had everything figured out. And then 465, 475, and then I started getting towards 485. And then that whole like goal proximity paradox kicked in, where it's like, you should be more motivated when you've got further to go. But like when you feel like you're within like sniffing distance of a lift, your motivation just goes through the lift, like through the roof. I would say like right now, I coach 5 guys who are 800 deadlifters, and not a single one of them got stuck between 770 and 800, because it was just like the second they feel that like, I'm there, I'm capable of it, just they're like a man possessed. They don't miss a single meal. They're going to bed early. They're training hard every session. And then things slow the hell down once they hit it. But I really got that goal proximity bias kicking in, where like I was crazed. I was like eating until I puke and then just chugging a bunch of milk, kind of slogging my way through a class and then just heading right back to the dining hall. I probably bulked my way up to about 230 pounds. Still really good body composition. I think because it's always been so hard for me to put on weight, I never really had to worry about too rapid of a weight of gain. It was never something that was an issue for me. Obviously, for a lot of athletes, that's something they should be really, really aware of, is like, hey, am I past that point of like, this is just a bad idea. This is not sustainable. I never had that issue of sustainability. Is like, if I could put on weight and then just maintain it, if it wasn't good initially, it'll become good eventually. And then I got to my first 500 and I went crazy. I was very happy. Like it was like a cool moment for me. It lasted about a day, and then I was like, there's people that do way more than that. 500 isn't very good. So I was like, I just went back to the grindstone. This whole time, not a bench specialist, very much not a bench specialist, a general strength enthusiast. I was, very much pushing my squat and my deadlift, and just trying to like, the big thing that kind of was this big disconnect for me is I competed in powerlifting when I was in high school, but I kind of just stopped competing and just we kept training like as hard as I possibly could. I didn't really need something to train for, but it was the training I thought was interesting. And part of that was a disconnect of, I didn't feel powerlifting was this test of general strength that I really loved when I first got into the gym. Is I want to be strong at pull-ups and lunges and squats. And it's like, I want to have a more holistic test of strength. So eventually, logically, I kind of got into strongman. But at this period, I hadn't really discovered strongman, and I was just training to get stronger. After that, I continued pushing because I really felt like, 500 isn't that good. There's other people that do this that are lighter than me. That's not that good, right? I don't see any reason if there's some dude in some other country that can do this while lighter, why can't I do more, right? It's probably just arrogance, but I'd never been proven wrong on it. So I just like kept pushing. Probably another year, I got up to about 530. That went pretty good. And then at this point, I kind of decided, hey, at some point, I'm going to do strongman. So I needed to really focus on my overhead strength. I started working on my overhead a lot. That came up pretty quickly just because I had the general musculature for it. Like I didn't start out particularly good. I think I got stapled by a 2-plate overhead press as a 500 bencher the first time I tried it. But then like 3 weeks later, I did 275 just fine. So it was like, it went okay. I started making my training a little bit more varied. And then I realized, hey, man, I'm closing in on another landmark. 550 sounds pretty good. Really dialed in. I don't even think I shifted my training economy that hard towards my bench press to do it, because I actually think I deadlifted 800 for the first time that same training cycle I did the 550 bench. So I didn't have to specialize for that one. And then after that, I started competing in strongman. So it would be like kind of seasonal. Like when I didn't have a strongman contest in mind, I'd be working on my bench pretty hard, back burner for a contest, work on my bench pretty hard. And it's obviously the rate of progression slowed when focus shifted away. And I just slowly, like 5-pound shipped every other training. It was probably every other training cycle I get a 5-pound PR up to 560. And then I watched one of your videos where you were saying how you thought pin presses were super cool. And I was like, that's interesting, because I've tried a lot of bench variations. I bench 3 days a week, and I bench 3 days a week. I press 3 days a week through this whole duration. When I was more focused on strongman, it would be 2 overhead, 1 bench. When I was a little bit more focused on benching, it would be 2 bench, 1 overhead. And then when I would really be focusing on a goal, it would be 3 bench press. So with 3 bench pressing sessions, I've got a lot of room for variation without really worry of my specificity being too low. So I tried a lot of things and kind of had my theories of what worked. Like light band tension always worked well for me. Emphasis on light. I kind of my way of like denoting that is just, it shouldn't take more than 10% off of the straight weight. I don't know what the bands weigh, but I just ignore them. It's just like, okay, this seems to be a reasonable amount of band tension. I'll keep those bands in my bag, and I'll just track the straight weight and progress it. I'm not concerned with what it weighs at the top. I'm concerned with what it weighs at the bottom, because that's the more challenging position. As long as I see progression in that in time, it seems to correlate well with my 1RM. Later, I found the Yukon bar, which is just the Titan Buffalo bar. And the reason I like the Titan one, even though it's probably a shittier bar, is just because like the degree of camber is a little higher. And as a close grip bencher, if I bench on a Buffalo bar, the range of motion is the exact same. It's like cutting almost nothing off of it. So I felt I was getting like no difference in training effect. But then I discovered this bar, and I was like, oh, this is adding like a full inch to my press. This is really relevant. So I'd experimented with a lot of bench variations, but I'd never really given a solid push to low pin presses. So I watched a video and I swapped out my primary bench day to low pin presses, and it went really well. I ended with a 5-pound PR over my best regular bench press. And so I was like, I don't know, I'm specialized into this now. So I'm kind of cheesing it, and I'm like really good at pin presses. So I didn't get my hopes up too much. So I just kind of told myself that was the same as a regular bench. But at that point, I kind of got that goal proximity itch again, really far away. But I called my shot on my YouTube, and I told everybody I was going to do 600. And I thought it'd be interesting, because I'd never done it before, to take a lot of my training economy and leverage it towards just one aspect of training. Because this whole time it'd been split across things. I think this is a big disconnect between like people like you and I who are strength enthusiasts. We know there's a really big difference between training to be well-rounded and having a good lift, and dumping every last bit of your training economy into it. Like if you're a 600-pound bencher, full meat, you are very good. If you are a bench only guy, congrats, you're 180 pounds off the best in the world, right? Even like a super heavyweight, if you can bench 630, you are a great full power bencher. A lot of that's the damage to the arms that happens with like the 1,000-pound low bar squats that happen beforehand. But nevertheless, right, it's like there's a massive gap between guys who dump every bit of their training economy into benching only and full power. And I was kind of curious. It's like, okay, what if I pull back to maintenance on my deadlift? I pull back to maintenance on my squatting, my front squatting, my event training, all these things come back to maintenance. I make this big push up in body weight because I've always comfortably maintained above a double body weight bench. So I knew if every time I've gained weight, it showed in my bench. I never had this like ineffective weight gain that didn't show in my upper end strength. So I had all these ideas of like, man, there's a lot of levers I haven't pulled. What if I pull them all at once? Can I like speed run my way to this 600 and check it off? Because the problem I was running into is doing a lot of benching was really impairing my overhead work for strongman. I don't think that benching is bad for overhead at all. I think that there's a point where you've hit huge diminished returns and you probably need to back off. And it's like the level of pec development that comes with a 600 bench press is going to be a bitch and a half to overcome to have a good overhead position. If you're benching 3 plates with a close grip, that's probably only going to help your overhead. So I think there's something there that like we can get into in a little bit, because I know you think that's interesting. But it was getting to the point where continuing to push my bench to higher and higher levels was getting in the way of me being a proficient overhead athlete. So I was like, okay, fuck it. I'm just going to get this 600 bench done. I don't know how long it'll take me, but I'm pulling all the levers. That way I can stop benching and focus on being a good overhead athlete rather than just being 1 foot in on both. So pulled all those levers, just like all my mobility work skewed towards things that was going to help my bench press. My nutrition revolved around the bench days, taking like obviously big caloric surplus, pushing calories, and also trying to come into every bench press session, retaining a good bit of water. All my accessories kind of skewed towards, hey, maybe this thing could tangentially help my bench press. Pulled all those levers, and it actually went a lot faster than I thought, right? There was a lot of hiccups, like a lot of pec strains I had in the low 300s. I had a rotator cuff injury in the high 200s. Definitely had setbacks, but the 565 to 600 was brutally hard. I felt like I was dying putting on that much weight that quickly, but it went really, really smoothly.
That's awesome, man. The journey of starting and hitting all those beats to like kind of summarize. I saw so many things that just parallel like what you would want to see in like a 1 paragraph cheat sheet to somebody on their first day. Because first of all, you said you started with the basic 5s and 10s, just bread and butter stuff, and applying yourself to it and getting better. But very quickly, you mentioned the importance of development, both from nutrition and physically getting bigger. And both of those seem to go over the heads of many strength hopeful these days. Powerlifters and strongman, their idea of nutrition is like a mukbang. It's embarrassing, like the relationship they get with food, where it's been known for a long time. I remember Brandon Lilly said it. He's like, you want to be like, what? You want to have your nutrition like a bodybuilder. You want to be as like capable as a strongman. You want to be like, you want to pair the best of all these worlds. So nutrition, hugely important. I heard that theme come up over and over and over. If your nutrition is not dialed in and you're not actively trying to chase either body weight or just general muscularity goals, you're selling yourself short. Like being untrained 130 pounds does not mean you're destined to be a 130-pound powerlifter. That is you before the journey started.
Well, that's something I think, like you said, the reason I think a lot of newer guys don't think about like the nutrition side of it and this whole weight gain thing, and they stay really light, is something that I never expected, right? I started out as like an objective. I was 5'10", 145. I was skinny, not as skinny as people get, but I was definitely skinny. And I never expected that. Now when I talk to people, every single person I talk to assumes I was a large person that started powerlifting. And they're like, oh, well, I'm not like you. I'm like, you definitely don't have the prerequisites I have. That would be very unlikely that just some random person I'm talking to at the gym, whatever percentile I am in, whoever wants to speculate that, whatever it is, very unlikely that the random person I'm talking to falls into that. But physically, you look the exact same as I did when I started, right? Everybody, it does me really dirty that my brother is an actual giant. So they're like, oh, you're both big guys. And I was like, no, it used to be I was the small one, he was the big one. Now I'm just the short big one. But I think that's a big thing, is people can't imagine that large of a change. It's the same reason that, like, I think people that grew up obese really can't even imagine themselves being skinny. It's not possible to have that level of change. I think our imagination for like our ability to change past the age of like 10 just falls off a cliff. So I just think that people can't imagine themselves. They're like, oh, I didn't start out as a big muscly guy. Those guys must have started out as big muscly guys. I just can't envision that level of change. Right? I think that's at least part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a factor, is people, like you said, their imagination, understanding that the change can happen. And then beneath that, I think there's an understanding, this comes with education, of whether or not it should. I think a lot of people have some deeply held beliefs about, and it's starting out before you get the education of what the journey is, what it looks like. And especially if, you're the guy that's always, let's say you are the skinny guy, well, you gravitate towards other thinner lifters, the guys that have the crazy DOT scores or Wilk scores or body weight coefficients. And it tends to reinforce like, well, that's my niche, when in fact, you might be better off doing something else. On the developmental side, we got the nutrition, and that's in service of what you realized very early, which is you need muscle to be stronger. More weight in this very real sense means more weight moved. And it's funny you mentioned Dan Green, because that was one of the first times I had specifically heard a pro say that same thing. He had an article. I can't remember if it's like the West of West Side article, but he says specifically in his journey to become this great squatter, he competed against this Russian that had quads that were just melting off of his legs. It looked like he had edema. And he's like, I know that I'm sure as shit not going to be able to match that record with quads that don't look like that. Like, I need to fill out all the parts. So you have the basic yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I think it was a great influence on me, but I think the information at the time was you remember, I don't know if you remember in powerlifting, there was this whole like big battle of the 220s where it was like Chris Duffin, Dan Green, Kevin Oak. Like that was like the weight class to be in, and they were all shredded. They're like, oh, they look like bodybuilders. And I think probably that narrative was very good for me to hear. I probably took it too far, right? To where my general physicality when I was powerlifting outpaced my results in powerlifting, right? Because it's like that pendulum can swing too far the other way, where it's like I had probably eventually too much of a bias towards base building rather than like, hey, what is the sport I'm doing, right? It's being proficient at singles at these three things, right? Just because we know that developing our physicality is like a critical part of that doesn't mean we can neglect the other side, where it was like anything I was doing that I thought wasn't building muscle, I would immediately be like, I can't wait for this shit to be over, this peaking phase. I don't even care. Like, why would I want to bench 300 pounds? There's people that bench 600 pounds. I want to go back to building muscle. Yeah. And so I didn't get skillful at the execution of peaking phases, which that's 1/3 of the sport. Probably like if we just break up our training and just hypothetically say we spend equal time in each, right? Like hypertrophy, strength, peak. We need to be good at that peaking. Every single successful powerlifter is pretty good at that peaking nowadays. Back then, you had these guys that were like regularly outperforming their meet totals in training over and over and over, and they could never get it to like appear on the day. Dan Green, my hero, very guilty of this. Like his heaviest deadlift was in training. For a long time, his heaviest squat was in training. And this idea of being good at powerlifting was probably undersold to me, right? And now I think we go the other way where people are like, yes, let's get really skillful at our top single and back offs and get really good at expressing kind of like your current machine. Maybe we're going to probably not think about building that machine to be a bigger machine, but you're going to get really good at doing as much as that machine is capable of, right? And I wish I had kind of had a blend of both. And then the other thing I thought was really interesting is I've always thought it, like I've noticed with a lot of my clients, it's either one or the other, that like a lot of the time sleep or nutrition is like the critical factor. Like for my brother, he can slack on his nutrition, but if he sleeps badly for like a day or two, his training goes down. Whereas I can sleep badly, but if my nutrition's on point, I've always felt it made up for it, right? So identifying like, hey, all of these things are important. I hate that YouTube question where like, oh, if you could only do one or the other. If you only do one or the other, you're going to fucking suck. Like this is a bad question and you're looking for an easy out to get out of doing one of them. You're going to suck. Like I understand this is a fun thought experiment, maybe, but frankly, it's probably not a good use of your time. You should just do both to the best of your ability because they're both really important. But I do think that maybe knowing yourself, which one, if you have to compromise one, like for me, if I have to stay up later to get my last meal in, that will make the next day's training better. Whereas for my brother, if skipping his last meal lets him go to bed earlier, that will make his next day like training better. And I think it probably has something to do with people that have big appetites are going to naturally be eating at least at maintenance, even when they slack. And so they can really focus on their sleep. Whereas like I would naturally be eating like 1,000 calorie deficit. So it's like, that's where I kind of naturally fall short. So that's where the additional emphasis needed to be placed. But I've always thought that was interesting that like some people fall on either side of the coin for which one needs to be their heavy priority if they've got a big session that next day.
Yeah. So, charting back over all of that. I mean, so we got at this end. I mean, we're talking about the periodization and the programming and the balancing of base and peak phases. Starting out though, at the beginning of your journey, it seems understanding the importance of development, the importance of nutrition, having that base. Then you mentioned skill, talking about the beat down that your body took and how you experience that differently just by getting more efficient, learning the scapular depression. And then as you go on, you talked about periodization, and then figuring out how to run instead of every week be better. Well, what about every 7 weeks? Which seems like this logical run from, novices can get better every 2 or 3 days. And then eventually it's got to be weekly. And then part of that gap that people run into is having the basic awareness and patience of being able to stretch that out farther. One, knowing that they need to or that they should. And two, being able to do it by not just getting fidgety and saying like, I just want to go ham every day I go into the gym. So you have these like multiple points of evolution of becoming more advanced with being able to balance more things. And then eventually you start talking about the really out there stuff, which is like specialty movements, pin presses, working with bands, not just working with bands, but bands you like in a way that you experimented with and found that worked for you and was easy to implement. The Yukon bar, all this stuff. And it just fits this really brilliant thread of like the things you focus on when you're beginning that set you up in the future. And I think it's funny how kind of hard you are on yourself because you're like, I really wish I did this other thing first. And it's like, well, here you are, a 600-pound bencher, you know what I mean? And you've managed to find these things that fit together and stack them together like puzzle pieces in a really logical way. And I mean, if you had to summarize in like just a couple of sentences, because you train a lot of people, you have the perspective of you, your brother, and the elite athletes you train as elite athletes. You also have the perspective, I'm sure, of the more run-of-the-mill, it's my first day here, or maybe I'm not going to be the elite guy, but I want to get as much out of my body as I can. If you could summarize in a few sentences just what you would tell somebody to focus on to kind of put first things first in favor of the things that they should focus on as they get better.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this last night when you sent me the questions, and I was like, oh, fuck, that's a hard one. And I was like, if I could convey to someone, like you said, like that road from like beginner to elite, right? It's like, like people are going to bully me in the comments like they always do. Yes, only a certain percentile of people could become elite, right? Yes, duh. Nobody is disagreeing with you. Genetics matter. I don't think anybody really is beating the whole genetics don't exist. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And like you could debate what percent that is. Is the cutoff like you have to be above the 70th percentile, right? And it's like I always thought it's interesting because there's probably like 3 groups of guys. There's guys who are so freaky that they could do everything badly and just be moderately invested and be elite, right? Not much to learn from those guys.
Which is why you don't pay attention to just your favorite big time bench presser, because there's world's strongest men that I would not trust to teach a little league team.
yeah. I got some people in mind, right? And then like you have another sliver where it's like, hey, you got to do things for a long time pretty darn well, and you're going to make it to elite, but you really have the makings for it. And then you have this bottom sliver of people who like, I don't give a shit what the numbers are, but you've got this bottom sliver of guys who it's like, if you are willing to wreck your health, if you're willing to sacrifice a ton of your social life, if you're willing to do all of these things and pick up every single, like you don't just flip over the big rocks, you're flipping every single rock you can find and you're doing it over and over and over for 20 years. You might just make it to being the bottom end of what we call elite, right? Those people are the people that you really want to learn from a lot of the time, right? Because they've had to flip every single rock because they had it in their head, like, I might be able to make it, but also a lot of the time, I think if we're being objective, those people shouldn't do it, right? The payouts for what they're doing is not worth it. They're just weirdos like you and me that do it because it's interesting, right?
It's Rudy. It's an inspiring figure who overcame all odds to do something nobody thought they could do. And you're right. I think a lot to learn from those people. But at the same time, it's like, well, if you want to sift people into a hierarchy of who's suited for what jobs, it's like, you got to feel that in your soul that that's what you have to do, because you're right. The return on investment is hard to justify.
Yeah. So it's like, you got to fall into one of those 3 slivers if you're going to make it to elite, right? Elite is extremely arbitrary. Some websites will tell you it's really not even actually very good. Some will set the standard really high. It doesn't matter. These are all really, really arbitrary definitions, but the only way to realize your potential, to realize how far you can go, and let's just say beginner to extremely advanced, because elite kind of has a connotation of compared to other people. Extremely advanced, I think people usually kind of understand to mean, well, you've done as much as your body will do-ish, right? Really, I think the simplest way you can boil that down is when you start, all you need to do to get better is go to the gym, right? And then, okay, maybe we need to understand some basics where it's like, okay, on top of our 5x5, we've kind of stalled out. Maybe we could just include a little bit of volume in the background, kind of do some bodybuilding work, put on some muscle, and that will continue you getting better. And then we're going to run into another plateau, right? It's just, you need to be willing to make level for like repeated level ups in your level of process as they're needed. You don't need to start out and jump in and copy the day-to-day life of a world's strongest man competitor. You just need to do whatever amount you need to do to get better, right? So it's like, okay, adding in that bodybuilding work, cool. I made another certain amount of distance. Hey, I need to fix up some basic errors I'm making with my technique. I'll make it another amount of distance. And you're like, okay, now I'm like kind of not weak, right? And then you're like, okay, to keep getting better, I need to start at least paying a little attention to my nutrition outside the gym. I'm just going to drink a protein shake. That's it. Like, it's not rigorous nutrition. Just after training, I drink a protein shake. My daily total goes up. Okay, I can continue getting better. Okay, I've hit another plateau. I'm actually starting to get like moderately strong. I'm one of the stronger guys at my gym, right? If I want to keep getting better, maybe I have to stop binge drinking every weekend, right? So it's like there's progressive accommodations you need to make in your life, and there's progressive level ups in your process. You don't need to make the advanced guy level ups to keep it moving. You need to make whatever you need to do, right? But they're going to get more and more invasive to your life, where it's like you make it far enough, you're going to be skipping out on camping trips regularly a lot of the year, because it's not just in peaking phases. You know, your off season matters and every session matters, and you're eating like a robot every single day, and you're going to bed at the exact same time, and your social life becomes really limited. And so eventually, yeah, if we really want to be as advanced as we can possibly be, we have to make all of these accommodations. Our techniques need to be dialed in. Our programming needs to be really dialed in. Maybe we need a coach if we can't be objective with ourselves, and we need to make that financial investment, right? There are, like, we probably are committing to some amount of daily mobility practices if we're a heavier guy. It's just more and more building on itself, right? The nice part for most of you listening, nobody is going to make, not nobody, hopefully a couple of you guys make it to this point. You don't have to worry about it ruining your life, right? You just have to meet yourself where you're at with, hey, I need to be a little bit objective. I binge drink every weekend. Hey, I don't eat on Sundays. I'm a skinny guy. I need to eat on Sundays. I don't eat my regular number of meals on my off days. That's my accommodation. My technique is a little bit off. You need to take whatever at your level you're at. But if we wanted that zoomed out view, it's just progressively leveling up and allocating more and more and more and more resources. And, like, people will take jobs that fucking, like, they're dead end jobs. They make no money because it leaves them a lot of mental free time to prepare for their training. They're like, this job, I'm never going to move up. I'm making minimum wage, but I know I get 3 breaks that I can eat my meals. It's the perfect job for me.
Yeah. And to kind of connect all of that to, I think, what you said, which makes so much sense and is simple and rational, and you hear that and like, well, of course that's how it goes. Like, do people struggle with that? To connect that to where people actually struggle, I think they do struggle with that because it's not so clear the foundational principle that it's starting with something, anything, a set of push-ups, just getting off the couch, walk around the block. That can be the segue into physical activity. And then making minimum effective dose changes as you go, instead of constantly trying to leap into what you think the shiny new thing is that's going to just overturn you or just supercharge your progress and turn everything over. I was guilty of that. Like, I'm ashamed to say how late into my training career I was guilty of that, of being, competitive in strongman. I mean, I was competing in nationals. This is before PEDs ever came into the equation. And I still would get frustrated and approach training like, no, I'm going to try this other program, or, there's this weird thing that I've never tried before. Let me throw that in and just overhaul everything and see what happens. And it really is just like, analyze what you're doing. Most of it's good exercises, consistent schedule, decent amount of effort. Is it running you ragged? Okay. If it's not running you ragged, you have things you can change over time, keep track of it in something that looks like a block, and then boom, there you go. And then when people look at stuff like periodization, and this is kind of the reason I started writing what I did, is because I think that mindset is essential, but not for the reason people think it's essential. Periodization originated with sports, where you have to balance 15 different things, and you have to have them all peak at the same time. You have to juggle all these impossibly, they all pull away from each other, and you have to get them to line up. And then you have something like lifting, where the variables you can count on one hand and they all line up pretty well together. I'd really think the periodization is just allowing people a framework where they can consciously make those changes. And then once diminish returns set in, you have a timeline to move on to something else where there's a little bit of novelty. And I think that's absolutely huge. And the sooner people realize that it's not mystical, it's not voodoo, it's not, rolling the chicken bones before you go into the gym, or hyping yourself up to Super Saiyan level 9,000, or finding the perfect program that you walk a tightrope on. It's like you said, it's brilliant for the new guy, because, or the guy that's not going to necessarily be elite, because you don't have to kill yourself. You don't have to sacrifice your whole life. It's like you start out with the 80-20 rule. If you do 20% of the shit right, you're going to get so much farther than you ever thought you could have. And you don't have to make that deal with the devil until years in, where you're like, no, I really want that world title. Now let me start, sacrificing time with my kids, taking demotions at work, and it always kills me when I see the people do that when it's their first day, or when they're brand new, because they're in the honeymoon stage and they think they need to sell their life, their house, their car, their obligations to train. And it's like, that's ass backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to agree with that. Yeah. I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to call that a mic drop moment then. All right, so I just want to put a pin in the bench topic, because I know we've talked a lot about it. Again, guys, Sam is not a bench specialist. He's a very strong, well-rounded individual, 800-pound deadlift. He's going to be, I'm sure, with his level of commitment, a very competitive strongman. But just to put a pin in this bench press discussion, because there's one or two more points I want to get to, because there's so much good information to pull out of this. I want to put in perspective really quick what a 600-pound bench is, because I started going through the open powerlifting list of all-time benches. And granted, these are in contest with a pause, but if you look at everybody who's ever put up a 600 bench raw in a competition, 92 of them were in the 308 plus category. And then 63 were in the under 308. And you said you were about 270. Well, the 275 class, there were 46 guys to have ever done a 600-pound bench. So just to give an idea of at least the order of magnitude of what you did, and how few people in the world can go in on any given day and reproduce that feat. It's just to show how impressive it was. The last thing I really want to ask is in regards to overhead pressing, because you're making this arc into strongman. The big three turned into the big four pretty recently. And if you want to chase something like a 600-pound bench, you have to have a pretty good idea of the degree of specialization you need. So given that most programs go squat, bench, deadlift, overhead, and so many people are throwing that in almost at a lip service, what's been your experience transitioning into strongman and focusing on overhead? What do you feel like it did for your bench? And what ways do you feel like it's unnecessary or overrated?
So yeah, let's go, I guess, one way and then the other way, right? So the overhead for the bench press, right? The way I think about it, right, is early in an athlete's training career, the requisite specificity to get better is very low. If we add weight to our tricep press down, our bench might go up, right? I miss those days because everything was really easy to buy into. If you do any press, your bench is going to go up, right? So this transference between all these different exercises was really high because we're just doing any pressing whatsoever. And I'm a big believer that that's something we should take advantage of, is when we can get away with really low specificity training and our key lift still going up, we should take advantage of that to build a wider, more varied physical base, right? And we could zoom that out and say, hey, we should have heavily varied training for the first 3 years minimum. So early on, I definitely think overhead pressing is going to carry over because it's a press, right? On some level, I've seen with some athletes that when they're really weak in the vertical plane, getting them in the vertical plane, whether that's a barbell overhead press or just any other vertical pressing motion, increases their margin for error on the bench press, even if they're pretty advanced benchers, if they're really, really far behind in vertical pressing strength. Like I've got a couple of guys that are in the mid 400s who were really under training their vertical pressing, and either their bench would go really smooth, or if they missed their bar path by even like a fraction of a millimeter, it would come right back down on them halfway. They had no ability to grind out a lift. And we found that increasing their overhead press just gave them a little bit bigger margin for error to where they could miss by that little bit and stick out a lift. Obviously, if it's a true max, we probably need to find that perfect bar path for it to happen. But I did find it improved the margin for error. So maybe if that describes you, work on your overhead press might give you really direct returns in your ability to grind a lift. But speaking generally, I like all of my benchers to be doing an overhead motion because, I think that having the shoulder joint be a little bit over prepared, because we can say, oh, shoulder stabilizers. The primary stabilizer of the shoulder is the deltoid, right? It's the primary like the biggest muscle that's moving the joint. I mean, I guess lats too, right? But it's probably good to have a bit of a surplus of strength, right? So it's like all of my guys, even if they're pure powerlifters, they never intend to compete in an overhead press, will have like somewhere in their program a vertical press just to check a box. And I find that their shoulders tend to stay a lot healthier as long, like they don't have to be good at it compared to their bench press, but as their bench press goes up, their vertical pressing goes up. Even if it's still wildly behind, I like to see that proportional climb. And it's just on one of the sessions per week, on one of their bench days, they're going to be doing a vertical press and then some kind of rear delt motion and then some kind of external rotation. Are you going to instantly die and fall apart if those things aren't present? No, but I find it's a pretty good box to check to keep athletes healthy. I find that people have less shoulder strains when they're low bar squatting when these things are present. And I think vertical pressing is absolutely part of that. And I noticed a lot of the good coaches on the tested side of powerlifting do something similar where they never expect any carryover from their dumbbell overhead press, but it's still something that's present in the program, very close to a competition, as something to like keep this general level of physical development. I also think how much it's going to carry over is very technique dependent. If you have a shitty arch and a close grip bench, you're probably going to see carryover. You're using your shoulders a lot in your bench. There's this huge horizontal travel component, which I think is a lot of the role of the shoulder in the bench press is that horizontal travel, potentially why the overhead press can help with fixing little issues with your bar path. So it's like, yeah, you might see a very strong correlation there. Whereas if you're someone who really, you don't even have to have this big circus arch. If you have the ability to turn that press into a decline, your scapular depression is really good, and your press just is more downward, right? We're going to be primarily reliant on our pecs and our triceps. Yeah, the overhead press is not going to yield you one-to-one carryover, though I still think some kind of overhead, whichever one you tolerate the most, whichever one you don't hate, should be in your program. I think the reverse is also kind of, I kind of feel the same way, where it's like, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to comment on that run up. So it sounds like you think you look at it mostly as far as like how the action of moving weight over your head and developing the deltoid that way is really about that kind of almost front raise type motion when you're kind of doing that that like J curve motion that goes back over your face, where you're kind of ramping it up to increase your leverage. Which is funny because I've always thought about it specifically from, you use your shoulders when you bench to a degree, you know, that the shoulders getting bigger and stronger creates more compression. So I always looked at it from like, actually, what is it contributing as far as vertical pathing? What you said makes perfect sense though. Like the arch pressing down towards your toes, absolutely less front delt really required for that. A lot more of the pec as a whole. And that makes a lot of sense. And when I think about overhead pressing and what I experienced, because I bench with a pretty close grip because my pec insertion then shoulders are dodgy at times. And I also don't arch anymore because it didn't do anything to develop my upper body, which that's a whole other saga. But I do feel a lot at the bottom of a bench the way I kind of feel at the bottom of dips, where there's a lot of mechanical tension. The muscles are stretched out. And the same thing with the shoulders. I feel like the bigger and stronger my shoulders are, the more tight they are. And all that compression really contributes to launching the weight off my chest. And the last thing I want to say, and I'll let you get back to it, is one of the reasons I have my biases coming from Strongman is there's this truism that goes around that, and I think you touched on this before, that benching a lot isn't necessarily going to do a lot directly for your overhead, except giving you some raw muscularity. But there's a lot of guys that bench, get really good. They can't overhead press their way out of a paper bag. But typically the guys in Strongman that only overhead press and hardly ever bench get pretty impressive benches regardless. And that's always kind of what I've looked at as like the case for overhead, is at least being a movement. It's like I can go into a contest, prep for a big overhead, come back 3 weeks later completely detrained, and I feel like I've lost maybe 5% off my bench, whereas it's not quite as true the other way. So I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I tend to agree, and I believe the reason that is true, right, is like, let's say we're a very skilled bencher, right? I would say if you bench press with minimal arch and a close grip, you could probably, I did get pretty good at overhead pretty quickly. But if we have a really, like what we would call like a technically proficient bench, probably the technique, like the technical model that seems to be yielding the most success, especially among tested athletes who can't just get infinitely bigger, it seems to be this more declined press biasing towards the pecs and the triceps. And I would go so far as to say, in my belief, usually the better the bencher, the less they're using the shoulders in the press, and the more they're biasing it towards their pecs and their triceps, usually, right? But you can get very strong shoulders and bench press with a lot of shoulders, right? And I think that's why you see that kind of one-way street is, yeah, if you've got really big shoulders and triceps, you can go do a bench press with a really low touch point where we're using our shoulders a lot, right? We can't really do an overhead press where we use our pecs a lot. Mitch Hooper's kind of putting that to the test a little bit, but I would say for the most part, right, I think the difference is that we can do this really shoulder heavy bench press and go put up a pretty good result, a pretty damn good result, right? Because it's like, I'm a bit of a goober. I've always got my heads in the clouds. So it's like, people will be like, oh, but Kevin Ferris did a 518 bench press with minimal training. That's proof that overhead is great for bench press. For a guy who's an elite of a strength athlete as he is, that's a okay bench. Like in his weight class for powerlifting, it's not even good. It's okay. If we're talking on the very elite ends of the spectrum, obviously that's a great bench press, right? Don't kill me, right? But for what he is as an athlete, I'm like, okay, that's a good result. It's not a great result, right? Brian Shaw tried to bench press 600 with the help of Josh Bryant. He never made it, right? Is he way stronger than me? Yes, but that's kind of, I would say that's my counter argument. Look at that guy, look at me, and then tell me like, yes, overhead definitely can prepare you for a pretty good bench press, and it has more carryover that way than the reverse.
Let me give you a little counter to that though,
because let me hear it.
You did say earlier that a 600-pound bench in a full meet is like fantastic, is like the best of the best. For the sake of it by itself, as a bench only specialist, not really. So we're talking about a population of people that have to stay so well rounded in so many different things, in addition to being some of the best deadlifters in the world, while also being conditioned and mobile, that also don't bench press. So if I'm trying to bridge a gap between these guys that hardly ever bench press, that are so well rounded in so many things, that without prioritizing it, I feel like that puts a little bean in the overhead press value bag. Because I mean, look at Olympic lifting, how that's changed just since they took the overhead press out. You're looking at the difference between a strict press. You're looking at the difference between a jerk and a strict press. And there have been articles written about the changes in physiques and how Olympic lifters aren't as strong in their upper body because they took this thing out.
Yeah.
To have a completely different movement pattern, vertical versus horizontal, and still get a lot of these guys kind of in that proximity with virtually no specific training, I feel like that says quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, right? So it's like I'm always coming from the perspective as someone who's really in the thick of it, which is just like, hey, you can't outthink specificity. I've tried a lot of times. You've tried a lot of times. You think you're going to have this clever way to get around something. And it's like, if your goal is to bench press, you should bench press. And majority of your training volume should be bench press. Now, if we're more zoomed out and you're saying, hey, I'm talking to these general population people and they're curious what lifts they should be invested in for general physicality, that's a totally different conversation. And I'm very much on your side. I think it's a phenomenal lift, right? I think that it should merit that fourth of the big three reputation. I think it does a lot for athletes, right? I think when we're getting into the conversation of like, what does it do for bench pressing? We're getting into the conversation of, well, we're saying the goal is bench pressing here, right? And it's like, we should do what the best benchers do, not, hey, these guys don't do the bench press, but they're getting a pretty good result anyway. You know what I'm saying?
I agree with that sentiment completely. And this is where what looks like an argument becomes not an argument once terms are defined clearly, because it is the population you're talking to and at what level of experience they're at and what specifically their goals are, because different strategies are going to be appropriate. My bias, not just as a strongman, but as somebody who is kind of anti-powerlifting specialization, not for powerlifting, obviously, but that's on my brand. It's not generally the audience, and I was working on a project with somebody who's trying to help me with my website and other stuff, and the questions kept popping up for design, like, what's your mission? Who's your audience? Who are you talking to? What do you want people to think about? And specificity towards any one particular sport doesn't really pop up. It's more about the bottom of the iceberg. Most of the people, like you said, there's so many more people that are newer and intermediate who are advanced, and those are the ones I want to capture. And even if they wanted to excel and specialize later down the road, they're best suited, in my opinion, by being more well-rounded. So I really hit those notes. But I completely agree with you that when that is the mission, when that is the thing you are trying to excel at, completely, that path to specialization, the farther you get, the more those branches diverge, and the same shit that helped you out a little bit doesn't give you as much. And I think that's self-evident. I think that coincides with how any rational person would look at a long-term training journey.
Well, I think you're 100% in the right. Like, if that should be how you
Always.
speak in videos generally, right? Because it's like most power lifters aren't even power lifters. They don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm John the power lifter. They're like, I'm John. I've got 2 kids. I just lift for fun. And sometimes once a year, my gym does a powerlifting contest and I enter it. He's not John the power lifter, and he's a power lifter. So it's
Yeah.
like, it's a super niche audience, right? And it's like, I have to remember that I am in a very different bubble where it's like my YouTube channel is small, so I like make a lot of niche content sometimes, and I don't work with anybody that is a really new to the gym lifter. Every single like, not to like big myself up, it's just the demographic that I found myself working with. I think almost every one of my clients benches at least 315, right? So it's like I become a little bit disconnected with people who are asking those early questions of like, but which one's better? Like if I'm going to work on one of them. I would say I've always kind of thought that was like a little bit of an overhead press guy talking point that I was like, I get where you're coming from, and I technically agree with you. But if you're just going to say overhead pressers are better at benching than bench presses are better at overhead, if we have any care in the world what we bench press, we should just do both. It's not that hard to fit them into a training routine,
For
right?
sure.
So it almost strikes me as that whole YouTube, like, if you could only pick one. Well, thankfully for me, I'm not on an island with 3 exercises. I will just do both, and then I'll be pretty good at both of them. And especially early in my training career, I'm going to be a more diverse and well-rounded athlete because of that. And I think that they're both going to carry over quite well to each other early in my training career. And then maybe later down the line, I could decide what I want to do, which is kind of what I always did, where I was just like, all I know is I want to be strong. I never thought of myself as Sam the powerlifter. I still don't yet really think of myself as Sam the strongman. I'm just a guy that really likes general strength training. And I'm going to try to, my next goal is I want to do a 880 deadlift, because I feel like that's kind of like the international standard to some degree in strongman, with no suit, because I'm a real man. And that way I just can like kind of check off just another box. And it's like, I'll decide what to do with being strong when I get there. I'm not too worried about it. I do, like, maybe I'll decide I want to go back to powerlifting. I have no idea, because I know that it's not the sport I'm passionate about. It's the training, and it's just general strength training that I love. And if I want to do something with that general strength I build, I will. But yeah, I don't know. I always thought that was an interesting discussion, because also it's like, a lot of strongmen are anti bench press, and it's like, okay, well, that's really contingent on our technique as well, right? Because it's like, I would say most guys know a close grip bench press is just a decent general developmental tool for the overhead. Why are we anti bench pressing? Oh, you think bench pressing with powerlifting technique is bad? Just don't bench press with powerlifting technique. Yeah, like having tremendous pec development, if you're a strongman, probably isn't going to, it's not doing me much good. It doesn't really come into play very often. Like, oh yeah, tangentially hugging a stone is a little bit better, and you have a little bit bigger shell. Like, we're reaching. These are guys, the people that are saying these things are guys who have really big pecs, who trained up a bunch, and are trying to justify that they didn't waste a bunch of time and training economy that they probably should have just dumped into their posterior chain.
Yeah, that's true. And we need to diverge into your strongman arc, because this is also interesting for me as somebody who that was probably my first real exposure to competitive sports, and that's where I've been focusing all of my time on, because there's so many stupid things. Yeah.
Oh, just before we leave benching, I thought about if I had any controversial opinions. I don't think they're that controversial,
yeah.
but I do have something that I'm gonna beat this drum until my arm falls off. So I've said for a long time that when you have advanced bench pressers and they're doing sub-maximal bench volume, they have enough speed off the chest that the bench press does not pose a very good developmental stimulus to the triceps anymore, right? Which is part of why I think you hear all of these really strong bench pressers constantly. You always hear, like, if you're interested in bench pressing, you kind of go dive down that rabbit hole. You hear all these giant roided up dudes be like, it's all about the triceps, and maybe lats, right? And part of that, I think, is a remnant from equipped lifting, where it's like, okay, yeah, we have a tremendous amount of mechanical assistance for our the portion of the lift where the pecs are the most dominant. The triceps are the part that have the least assistance. Those are probably going to be the most relevant, as well as the ability to row that bench through your shirt, right? But I also find that among those guys that are really big and they've done a bunch of bench volume to get that big, just benching continues to develop their chest quite well, right? Usually the reason that they're doing, let's say they do 15 work sets of horizontal pressing, the reason they're not doing 16 is usually because their pecs can't recover. Usually they're good enough at benching that their shoulders aren't taking a huge beating. It's the pecs that they've kind of reached their maximum recoverable volume on. The triceps haven't, right? And I think part of that is because Mike Tusher actually put this up on his story. It was like the most validating moment of my life, because I consider him like one of the smartest coaches ever. I mean, he invented RPE, right? So maybe that makes me sound a little bit smarter, that he's been saying the same thing, which is like, maybe we need to either do direct work for the triceps afterward, because the bench press, we're getting so much momentum out of the bottom as an advanced bench presser, blah, blah, blah. They either need additional volume afterward, or we need to make use of variations that kind of kills that momentum off the chest, like a band, right? Where we have to continue to, because he's also said something I thought was really interesting, which is in some ways, a set of 8 against bands is more specific than straight weight, right? Because depending on your bench technique, it's largely a throw coast, right? Whereas when you put a really heavy weight on the bar, you have to throw and then continue pressing through. So the bands in some way create some level of specificity there. I'm not a big bands guy. I'm not a big conjugate guy, but that's something I've always thought was interesting. But on the other side of the coin, I think that's led a lot of new lifters astray really badly, really, really badly, right? You hear all these elite lifters say, oh, it's all about the triceps. All of my, like, I just bench and then I do triceps. And it's like, most beginner lifters, most intermediate lifters are weak off the chest, right? Because they're not musculature that we use that much in our day-to-day life. It's a position we don't spend much time in. It almost inverts. The newer the lifter, the more time they need to spend developing the pecs and shoulders to get that power off the chest. And then eventually they're going to be benching enough to where that's very disruptive to the pecs. And then we have to worry about the triceps, but they don't have to worry about coasting through their lockouts ever. If you've watched a guy really new, it's shaky, it's slow. I assure you the triceps are doing plenty of work for the top half. There's no momentum there. So it's like, I actually heard Dan Green, speaking of, was the first guy I heard talk about this. And he's like, most newer lifters just need to spend a lot of time building up their pecs through dumbbell benches, through dumbbell overheads, through pec flies, and dedicate a lot of training economy there. And I think that's something that's been missed. Like you said earlier, is like, just like how we don't want to copy John Hack's training because we're not looking at the 20 years of gym history that came prior in the base building. And that, like, yes, requisite specificity to get better goes up as you're more elite. Well, that's the most elite guy we've got. So his specificity is going to be sky high. Same thing with Andre Milanichev. You're skipping the part where he was a bodybuilder, right? Just like how we don't want to copy their training in that regard, I think the muscular emphasis we place on our bench assistance work also is something that changes, right? It's like Julius Maddox has so much speed off of his chest, right? It's like, yeah, he probably doesn't need to spend a ton of time on the pec deck, right? A lot of the new guys at my gym would be really well served just hopping at the end of their bench day. If they just did 3 really tough sets of pec flies with a pause at the bottom, I genuinely think that would really help their bench press. People say, oh, pec fly carrying over, that's not a compound. You're not at the point where it needs to be a compound. You just need bigger pecs. So it's I think that big, like, what you need to work the most on for your, I think it's the same reason that people say that recreational bodybuilders, like that are beginner level, bench more than recreational powerlifters. I think it's because they got a chest day, to be perfectly honest.
For women too, we see that a lot in strongman, that some of the best women that translate over are the ones that have a physique background. When you think strongman, no, you need Olympic lifting and you need to be athletic, you need to have whatever. And the upper bodies that come from women that have pieced apart their body is night and day from the women that were just power lifters or just Olympic lifters, or that even started in strongman and got very good. Their ability to crush stones, their ability to like support, it's insane.
But I think you can cue them a lot better because like they've done so much varied movement. Like I would argue that bodybuilding is the best GPP work you could have for a strength athlete, right?
100%.
Just like how like an athlete, like a real athlete, like a field athlete, the weight room might be their GPP work. But it's like, what's the requisite quality that we're always looking for? Is like, usually we can predict how good, like even that one study that everybody loves to cite, even in good powerlifters, cross-sectional area predicts very, very reliably who places where on each lift. The guy with big quads usually has the biggest squat.
So that goes back to, again, pulling the lens out, like how do we handle new lifters? And I've always been interested in the stark difference between the two schools of thought, because on the one hand, you have what a lot of people do, which is bodybuilding when they're new, trying every machine in the gym, reading muscle mags, whatever. On the other end, you have like starting strength, which is completely hyper specialized to one lift and one rep range. They both work pretty well, but youth sports as a whole kind of goes by that varied model. And even Boris Shako, who writes very, very specialized type of powerlifting. It's essentially Olympic lifting applied to powerlifting, is skill development work. His novice program is a bunch of varied shit. It's push-ups and lunges and dumbbells and machines. And I think that's really powerful. And if I had my way about it, I would probably bias people towards that type of training in order to foster that base that can be used much more effectively to specialize down the road. And it's funny when we think about the type of accessory that any individual needs. I mean, I can think of elite guys. It's funny how you can diverge so much from our innate predisposition, because we're all mechanically so advantaged at lockout. Like everybody should be 100% stronger at lockout, right? Everybody should be. But when you see, like I used to train around Leroy Walker a bit, and to see somebody throw 700 pounds off his chest and miss it like right here, that it didn't make sense to me. But years of training like that, you can see how guys are like, well, that's where I get screwed up. That's it's important. You got to train lockout, got to train triceps. And over time, to see how those bits of advice get taken and applied to everybody in kind of a blanket fashion.
Yep.
But you have the fact that it doesn't matter what you can lock out if you can't press off your chest, which is why really good equipped benchers don't like being asked what their raw bench is. And the fact that that is an area that doesn't develop muscularly because of our day-to-day activity. So it's like, yeah, get the pec strong. And I myself have had the same problem because I didn't develop from benching because I had such advantage leverages. My chest didn't have a reason to grow. Once I started doing flies and dumbbell work, my chest exploded. And I'm like, oh my God, it's like pressing on a feather. Not everybody's case, especially the more advanced you are, I'm sure. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right with the way that people shouldn't put the cart before the horse.
Well, I think it also ties into you being a close grip bencher. I've had a theory about this for a while, that I've always liked the idea that your assistance work picks up what your primary technique misses, right? So it's like if you have a very like hip back dominant low bar squat, we should probably be selecting assistance work that's going to bias toward the quads, like the muscles that we're not using in our competitive technique for like long-term well-roundedness and development, right? And so it's like, I've always said like, yeah, if I've got a wide grip bencher, I always tell them like, hey, we're going to do some kind of close grip or bias towards the triceps, like the muscle we're getting away from. And myself, I also bench with a pretty close grip. I'm a thumb away from the smooth. I started to realize, I'm like, that's what I'm missing in my program, is I'm not doing anything with a pretty significant degree of elbow flare. So I started noticing that when I did dumbbells and pec flies, it was like filling in a gap of what my bench press was failing to develop. And then also the other thing I thought was really interesting, like you said, is like, I think it's an accepted thing within the Russian sports model that early specialization in sports leads to worse outcomes. You keep the kid playing 3 sports through X, like they've got a rough framework, and they've got like, I've even heard they've got like theories as to what sports are best. Like I hear gymnastics and wrestling for just like general proprioceptive awareness and being upside down, yada, yada, yada. But I think it's also really interesting is we can take that framework that they intentionally put athletes through when they're in sports school. We can also take that and look at athletes that are coming to us as coaches, and that's going to inform things. So it's like, if I have a guy who's played sports every season since he was 5, yeah, you're not doing lunges and burpees and you're not getting on the treadmill. We're actually going to delve you straight into some, like, depending on your goals, some amount of just straight powerlifting and some amount of bodybuilding. We don't need to develop these general coordination properties. And there's all these cool like elasticity qualities of the tendons and force absorption qualities that we get from like dynamic sports that like, yeah, we shouldn't skip that step. And if someone's coming to me as like a very serious lifelong athlete, they've done that, right? They've kind of did that themselves. It wasn't in some big picture plan thing. It just worked out really nice for me as a coach. But on the other side of the coin, like you say, someone comes to me and they've never played a sport in their life. It's like, oh man, we're going to start with like a general fitness routine. We're going to do like time on the treadmill, maybe some sprint intervals. Like it's going to be plan makeup to all of the people that are competing against you that got to do that heavily varied period of training early on that we speculate is so freaking helpful.
Yeah, no, it is such a big thing. And, you know, especially in Western culture, American culture, you know, so many parents of athletes, God help you if you train high school kids and you have to deal with them, think that, you know, they're going to go the Tiger Woods route, you know, or they're going to take their 4-year-old and have them just shoot hoops from the free throw line every minute of their life. And it's going to be the next Michael Jordan. And it's so damaging. I want to transition into your strongman journey. How are you doing on time? You all right?
I got all day. Me and Max are training at like 6 p.m.
Oh yeah. Don't tell me that, man. I'll go 4 hours. Okay.
I'm like you. I like talking about training. Gets to the old noggin jogging.
So let's transition to your strongman journey. How are you finding the transition? What issues are you up against? Like where's your brain at right now with that arc that you're working on?
Yeah, so it's like do you know Zach McCarley? He was competing with you, right? He trained at a gym near me back when I lived in Washington. I've never actually met him, but he's got a really good series of videos called Strongman Theory, which I recommend any of your viewers that have not checked them out. Check them out. It's just it's a framework. I think you have very similar videos where it's just like, hey, what are the underlying things that make a good strongman? Chad Wesley Smith also has a pretty similar video. Everyone has a little bit different spin of what physical qualities they think makes up the strongman and how that should be allocated across a week of training, right? But it's like, okay, yeah, we've got the deadlift, we've got overhead, we've got, some people would just say moving events. Some, like, I think Chad Wesley Smith always just said, like, hey, if you're good at deadlifts, overhead press with leg drive, farmers, yoke, and stones, you're going to be pretty well equipped for most shows. There's always going to be one event maybe that you got to figure out on the fly, but the general physicality built by those core events and the fact that you're probably going to be contesting at least 3 of them is going to lead you to be pretty good if we can train those things. Zach McCarley has a little bit more like general. He's got static strength. I think he's got moving, grip, medley, something else, right? Whatever it is, it's really good, right? So I kind of familiarized myself with those things, and that really clicked with me. It's like, oh, okay, we've got these classes of movement. I need to identify which ones I'm deficient in and work that class of movement, right? Rather than just say, hey, your job is to be really good at low bar squats, max arch bench press, and sumo deadlift, right? Those aren't classes of movements. They're very, very specific things. I say those because those are the techniques that I would use if you threw me back into powerlifting. I've always pulled more sumo. So it's like, yeah, I guess if I was trying to be a powerlifter, I would pull sumo. Whereas like general classes of movements, it's not just deadlifting. It's deadlifting for a 1 rep max, it's deadlifting for reps, and it's deadlifting from varied heights, which I'm like, that gives me so many little, like, like I said, I've always really liked your channel because I could tell you're just a weirdo like me that likes tinkering with these things. And I'm like, oh, that's so much fun. Every new contest is a puzzle. So it's like I was kind of breaking it down in my head when I was like writing out my general plan for this like off season. And it's like, my deadlift from the floor is okay. It's not great. I pulled 835. I'd like to pull 880. If this 120 kg class that people are talking about becomes a thing, that'll be perfect for me because I can bulk into that class and it'll be fun. But if I'm competing with the big boys, I really need to pull more. And then within that, got okay rep endurance on the deadlift, and I probably need to work a little bit more on my elevated height pulling. I'm good from 18 inches and I'm good from the floor. But if I have a contest, if it's like an axle pull that falls somewhere in between, okay, I got a little bit of work to do there. I'm going to force squatting to be a big priority, mostly just because I've never done a squat I'm proud of. And I think it correlates generally with like good physicality that carries over to lots of events, yada, yada, yada. Most good strongmen place a weird amount of emphasis on the squat, even though it's a generally contested exercise. The vast majority of good guys do, so I'm going to do it. And I also just want to do a squat that I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty good at squatting because I'm built really well for it. Got a really long torso, I got really stubby legs, and I got good mobility. And the fact that I have not been able to figure that puzzle out kills me. So even if it's probably not the smartest thing for strongman, I'm going to figure out squatting. I'm going to do 800 in sleeves, and I'm going to ride off into the sunset and actually train for the sport again. But yeah, I've kind of broken it down. I'm like, okay, I got these couple of things that like are really, really general movement patterns that I want to be good at. I want to be good at squatting. I want to be good at deadlifting. I'll be good at overhead with leg drive and also without leg drive, because I think that the bigger the diameter of the object, the more strict shoulder strength comes into play. Like though it's really extreme Mauser block, like, yeah, the meta for the most part is strict pressing it. Like 12-inch log, especially for smaller guys like you and I, there's a big demand for static strength in the shoulders there. You can't just weightlifting your way to a big log press generally. Because I always hear people say that they're like, oh yeah, if a weightlifter came and tried powerlifting, they would crush the log record. We saw that. He was good. He didn't beat Big Z. Misha did, I think, 470 log, which is great. But the margin for like he would have to spend a long time developing those strict qualities in the shoulder. Yeah, so I've got I get to screw off with benching. I know my triceps are plenty strong. If I can lock out 600, I can lock out anything over my head. So it's all about kind of developing the shoulders as well as the skill of that dip and drive where I'm a little bit deficient, and working on getting my front rack back has been a bitch and a half. But yeah, and then I just got, okay, I got to have good grip. As a guy with small hands, that's a year-round emphasis for me. Got to be good at this general pattern of loading, which is a work in progress because my gym doesn't have any sandbags, and I just got one Titan off-brand Stone of Steel that I train on, which is better than nothing. It's better than nothing, but it's like, okay, my loading needs work. And then my moving events is a real mixed bag because I'm just lucky. Like I've always been very athletic. You know, every sport I did when I was growing up, I was probably underskilled at and relied on being like fast and having good reaction times. And for some reason, without working on it for 10 years, that's kind of persisted. Like I would say I'm nowhere near as athletic as I was when I was 220, but I would say I feel pretty comfortable. Toss me against most 260, 250-pound guys, I'll come out as the more athletic one 9 times out of 10. So a lot of my like lighter moving events are good. My yoke sucks. So that's another thing that's going to be like a year-round kind of focus for me is just heavy yoke every other week through the whole off season. Just you got to do it because you're bad at it, and eventually you'll get better at it because you do it.
Yeah, that's the big puzzles, all these different points and different things hold different people back, which makes it very hard to give kind of a blanket order of operations for how people should prioritize things. When I started out, I started training at East West Strength in California, which is known for turning out a lot of pros. And every endurance medley we did was the worst thing I ever did in my life. And I always thought like, oh, I'm just out of shape. No, the weights were too heavy for me. So everything I did was maximal effort. And I realized very quickly if I was strong enough to be able to, and skilled enough to be able to efficiently move without expending effort, the demand dropped and I was no longer like on my deathbed after a minute 15 of all out effort. And a lot of other people have the opposite. Somebody in your situation, starting out strong, you have a huge potential to do all of these. It's just a matter of getting comfortable enough that strength and stability can be directed towards the specific demands. And everything is like uniquely weird about what carries over and what doesn't. I hate yoke. I hate it with a passion. I know it's not going anywhere. Doesn't carry over to anything. Nothing else really carries over to it, except sometimes maybe for people for some weird reason that's hard to predict. And it detrains very quickly. I've worked to the point, I mean, the last good yoke performance I had was at the Arnold, and I took 5th out of like 28 guys, and there was about a second split between me and first place, and I was proud of that. It was an 800-pound yoke. I got stubby legs like you. I struggled with it. The only thing that did that was yoke sprints week after week after week after week, and even undulating so I could get lighter work in throughout the week leading up to a peak. But then if I take 2 months off, it feels like it's my first time carrying a yoke. And you can look at the World's Strongest Man when they had the yoke's first break over 800. It wasn't that long ago. And you see Mark Felix, who's like a 900-pound deadlifter with an 880 yoke, like doing this down the track. There's middleweights that can run. Zach McCarley's one of them. Zach McCarley's a hobbit, and he was not nearly as statically strong as these other guys, but he's an athlete. He was a wrestler. He could run with 900 pounds on his back. And that specific skill set is so weird. But it is an art form, not just figuring out what events carry over to each other, but which ones carry over for you, because it's going to be subtly different for everybody.
Well, it's so funny because it's like you look at the guys that are good at yoke, and it's just like, well, fuck, they've always been good at yoke. And it's like, what physical quality, like, because like I know Mitch Hooper is like, oh, I've done a bunch of running, right? So it's just like, yeah, extremely low like intensity, huge volumes. Sure, I can kind of understand how that builds this base and gait that like, but like the first time you ran a yoke, you just sprinted with 1,000. It's like, then it's like you see a lot of these guys, like it's Matoush was never bad at a yoke, right? And it's like, God damn, I really have my work cut out for me to figure out what physical quality, because it's like it's not so simple like a squat, where it's like, okay, you've got like a general balance and skill component, but then it's just like trunk strength, leg strength, depending on how you squat, hinging strength. Cool, boom, pow. Which one are you weak at? Fix it. It sucks. It's hard, but it's simple.
So I would say don't dissect it the way you would a power lift, where you're looking in terms of main movers and how do I develop muscularity. For one, the points where that's relevant, like your midsection, your upper back, that grows plenty strong from doing yoke, because you don't need like full range of motion for my erectors and upper back to get the muscularity. It's very specific to what it's doing, which is an isometric. And your potential, if you specialize in that, is huge. Just like your potential, if you just start doing like 1-inch lockouts, like 6 board presses, your potential to move a lot of weight is very, very big without having to worry about actually getting big muscles secondarily. So I would let the yoke work do that for you. The big thing I would really warn against, because a lot of people go down this rabbit hole. They're like, I'm just going to do, I knew this guy that trained with Jerry Pritchett and Easton Taylor. and I've known
That's
him for a
funny. I
long
also
time.
know somebody who trains with Jerry Pritchett, and he's constantly doing the slowest, heaviest yokes I've ever seen.
So this guy I've known, we're both good overhead pressers, so we have this rivalry. And we used to talk a lot of shit to each other. But he was talking about his yoke. He's like, "Yeah, Jerry just said you're going to be under 1,000 pounds every week." And in my head, I'm like, I don't know that that's a good approach. And yeah, again, Jerry's a great athlete. What works for him might not work for other people. For me, I fall apart very easily when yokes get too heavy too often. Especially, I can't imagine with you the stress of the weight you're squatting, the deadlifts you're doing. That shit compounds, and yokes run you down. I got a lot as somebody who's built similarly, short legs, long torso, and I didn't have the athletic background. I was very slow to adapt to it. Treat it like a skill. And you're even down to your gait. There's a bunch. You can go narrow and have it high up and be very upright. You can get it lower, like I do, feet a little wider and kind of spider walk. Whatever it is, pick it, stick with it, and it's skill work. And all the runs you do at 50% for speed, all the 500-foot rucks you do, everything is the same thing. And eventually, your body gets better at allocating strength, and it's very counterintuitive, but it is. It's more volume, more practice. Skill, skill, skill. I would really avoid the heavy rucks, because even if the weight feels better, it doesn't mean you're going to move better, and that shit comes with such a cost. It's I can't stress. It's my least favorite event. I fucking hate yokes.
Well, that was something I picked up on pretty quick, because like it's an interesting perspective to have. Like some aspects I feel like I'm quite advanced at, and some I'm relatively new to. But it's nice because I can tell people like, hey, if you were getting into squatting, like how would you go about learning, right? And I was like, okay, let me go kind of look for commonalities, not unique things among good yoke runners. And that was the first thing I noticed is they're not doing slow runs in training except for their last heavy touch before the competition. It's more repeated bouts of like pretty traditional speed work, right? Just like lots of EMOMs, like depending on the guy. And I was like, okay, I picked that up pretty quickly. And it was just like the contest I did before last, we had like a 750 yoke, and I didn't do 750 in training, and it went really, really well. Maybe next time I'll do it like once, but that was something I picked up on pretty quickly. Is just that no one who's good at it is doing these old, like I saw these guys that were not that strong doing the most painful looking slow 1,000-pound, like 10-foot carries. And I'm like, man, I'm bad at yoke, but I'm better than you. Clearly this isn't like the best use of training economy, but the part that I'm really, do you rate chain yoke at all?
So that's what I started using before yokes were easy to come by. Rogue didn't exist, so we had to homemade our equipment. So I've used chain yoke before. I think it has application. We tried using it not that long ago as an accessory. That's a tricky one though, because I think it depends where the person's deficient. And even if you get kind of good at it, like you said, speed is such a big component. I would say more so than the stability. So if you've got a like buttery, noodly midsection, chain yoke kind of forces that, but it really hinders your ability to accelerate, which is it's like controlled falling. Every rep you do, you're focused on the drive, being faster on the line than the other guy without the thing swinging on you. And then as you get moving up speed, forcing your feet to hit faster and tighter, even when you feel like you're going to buckle under it. And eventually I'm at the point I can't do slow yoke walks. My instinct after 15 years of drilling this shit is if I pick up the weight, I'm like falling forward trying to catch myself. And it's a matter of patterning.
Yeah. Because that's something I've been like, playing around with this idea is like, I'm no fool. I don't think I'm going to beat specificity. The best way to get better at yoke is to do yoke regularly. Obviously, there's certain loading parameters like you talked about. It's like, yeah, you deviate from smart loading patterns, your specific training becomes kind of shitty, right? But it's like, I see a lot of guys try to get good. It's the old, like, build your deadlift without deadlifting. Good fucking luck. There's a reason that guys now are raw outperforming that by 150 pounds because it's still a skill, right? And it's like yoke is definitely more complex than a deadlift is. So that's not lost on me, but I was always like, it's a real weakness of mine. So it's like after the specific amount of work, that's as much as I can handle. I was like, I noticed like I've got no issues with stability through the midsection whatsoever. Like it feels fine. But my hip stability, which is weird because I do a lot of unilateral work. So I thought that I would have a little bit of a heads up, but I'm sure I do, right? Like I train by myself, so I don't have any comparison, and maybe I'm less shit at it than I think I am. But I was just throwing in like belt squat marches, and I was considering throwing in chain yoke, maybe just as like a lighter assistance day, not ever taking away from the work itself.
The chaos of the chains, and it's better than nothing. But the chaos of the chains means that when you get better at it, it's usually because you just got better at timing your steps in reaction to the chains. I mean, you could think that, hey, if I got really good at chain yoke, would my yoke get better? It's the same way that it's like, if you're a newbie, think of the things that make you better. It's like, yeah, probably if your yoke was so terrible at the beginning that any stimulus made it better. But given how strong you are, given the fact that you're not hindered by your midsection, which is rare for somebody starting out, you're trying to pattern a specific gait. And gaits are more complicated than people think. And I would not try to pick apart your gait. I would try to treat it holistically, just like your body learned how to walk in the first place. You'll pick it up. It just takes more time and dedication than any one person probably wants to give it. But that's a superpower, though, because you've done that with these other lifts already. And that's what most strongmen don't do. The average strongman, there's not a lot of guys that are great at dissecting their training. Generally, what you see are guys that are big, strong. They've always been kind of explosive, and just the right number of events fit in their wheelhouse that they were able to outperform other people early on. So you see a lot of meteoric rises. This is so much worse in the weight classes. Meteoric rises, and then guys either plateau or they drop out. Or they move on. If you're Kevin Fairs, Rob Kearney, Nick Camby now, Andrew Clayton, dominate the middleweights, you either go up to the heavyweights, or usually people peter around for a year and then drop out. So the number of people that have stayed and worked and grinded to take their shit lift and make it better, not as many as you think. And that gives you a big superpower. And that also brings me to the point that you were talking about what weight class you're going to compete in. You're equipped physically to dominate the 105s right now. I mean, if you could do a 20-pound weight cut consistently, you're not going to be as absolutely strong as you want to be, but your deadlifting and overhead ability, given with the tools you have and your willingness to put in the work, if that's something that appeals to you. I mean, I like throwing in with the heavies because it's fun, and I've done that. I've probably been in 24 heavyweight shows as a result. But I could very easily see you in the next couple of years, because the guys at the top are guys with mid-800 deadlifts, and if you compare that with a 400-pound overhead press on anything, that's like 3 guys that you're talking about. And that strength dictates your potential ability to do good at everything else. That's just a matter of skill and practice. But there's guys that are great yoke runners and good overhead pressers, but they can't deadlift for shit. You can't leave those points on the table. Or there's guys that can lift and run with anything, but they can't press, and you can't leave those points on the table. So you're in a really good position if that's something you wanted to do to dominate that weight class. Because I would say there's a vacuum right now with a couple of the guys that phased out.
Yeah, the other thing I've been trying to obviously a good thing taken too far becomes a bad thing, right? Is I've always felt that I started out somewhat strong, but not particularly strong. But I've always felt like my genetic strong suits are always been that I've been always been very explosive. Like when I weighed about 215, 220, and I was taking one of my college classes for exercise science. And they just needed a data set to have us do some just regular statistical analysis. So we did a bunch of low classes, a bunch of tests. And I had a 38-inch standing vertical at 220. And it's just I've always been really, really explosive. And I always felt that was a benefit. And then I've always felt a lot of the reason I've made it as far as I have is that I'm very durable, right? And I've got a good ability to adapt, which I think a lot of people really underrate. They think
that's huge. So important. Nobody talks about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's I think a lot of people are oh, these guys just started out with the physical qualities that correlate with that sport. It's some of them, yes, and some of them were just silly putty, and it's they're just weirdly good at adapting. Whatever genes regulate their ability to adapt to whatever demands. They could have got the bone density, they could have got these explosive qualities, and I've always found that you throw me into an environment, throw me into a sport. I've always felt I'm very adaptable and I'm very durable, because all of my injuries have gone away relatively quickly. Knock on wood. And that's something that I've leveraged really heavily in my training, is knowing that I'm more I'm still young. So maybe this is a young man's fallacy and I'm just going to fall apart when I hit 30. I'll take that on the chin. But I think even compared to people my age, I know guys that can't handle half the total training volume I do. And it's that was something I've really leveraged heavily. It's I know I can press 500 pounds on the bench 3 days a week, and I could probably do that for months. At one point, I was just curious because I'm bad at squatting. I squatted over 660 every single day for a month, and I was fine. I didn't feel anything went wrong.
You should have been a Bulgarian athlete, because that's the
born in the
difference.
wrong country.
And the way you train too is indicative of that. You're like, well, let's find out what works. You found out that more training frequency works, not just because it's better for conditioning or response. Okay, does this make you stronger? Yes, but also, let's say this makes me this much stronger if I do this, but my ability to handle it's right here. It doesn't make any sense to go above that. And that's what I felt with, because I am not durable. And I feel like conservatively over my most competitive years, probably the last 5 years I was competitive, I conservatively think I left 150 pounds on my squat and deadlift, because there isn't a single session I can point to in that time where I was able to hit the gas. Everything was, my hips are so fucking raw, I can't get out of my Corolla. Stepping up on a curb, I'd wince in pain. Everything's ibuprofen and Voltaren and a half-hour warm-up before I could carry a yoke or before I could touch my toes in order to get on a stone. That durability is so important. It's genetic, yeah, but you can also foster it by being smarter than, well, I was. So
it always cracked me up that people say joint size matters for that. I have below average wrists. I'm fine.
Really?
I don't like, it's like, yeah, no, my ankles are tiny. Like, I have to do a little bit of homework for them, because I think probably because, like, my brother has giant ankles and wrists, and he doesn't need to do his wrist extensions and seated calf raises every week. I do, but if I do them, I'm fine. I can squat heavy like 4 days a week. But the other thing, I was curious if you have any thoughts on this. I've really noticed that, like, again, like, I've always thought it's always interesting when you see, like, man, there's just athletes just kind of diverge seemingly randomly in their response to, like, the sleep food paradigm, right? The other one that I thought was really interesting is I've noticed some guys make better technical progression doing a lift once a week rather than, let's just say, twice, because they know it's their only one chance to practice it, and they think about it leading up. And so it's this huge priority that are like, this is the only chance I have to get better at this. I need to do it right. Whereas if you get them doing it more often, it becomes going through the motions and it becomes mundane. So I've seen guys, like, their technique morphs to be much better when the sessions are less frequent, but they are definite in importance, right? Like, my brother really responded to us pulling. He's also a super heavyweight, really strong. So it's like, yeah, you pull back frequency. Everybody does it. Despite what Paul Carter says, absolute weight has some bearing on our ability to recover, and Hafthor isn't just an idiot who would be way stronger if he squatted twice a week. Unrelated.
What a Paul Carter rant, man. God, I could go off on that.
But yes, but then I've always been on the exact opposite side of the coin, where it's like, part of it's, I think my brain doesn't work. Like, I don't have an internal monologue at all. Like, I have no words in my head ever, which everybody says, like, that's like an NPC thing. Like, none, 0 words. There's no words ever in my head. So maybe that's probably, like, I can't think about the session leading up to it like other people can, but it's like the only way I've ever gotten more technically proficient at anything is through leveraging frequency. My bench only got better when I did it often. My squat only got better when I did it often. I was pulling 4 days a week from the floor, and that was the only time my deadlift actually got technically more proficient. So it was like, for me, that's the only way I can learn, which is really lucky that I physically have the capability and the durability to do it, or I would fucking suck.
Do you have aphantasia, where you don't have pictures in your head?
I got nothing in my head.
So like
everything happens in, like, I don't know. I've always felt like some weirdo, like, saying something's unique about me when it's true of everybody, but, like, literally nothing in my head. Everything just comes from my subconscious. Like, I just start saying words and they come out relatively coherent.
That's crazy. There's a whole, like, YouTube series on that, because that's something people didn't know about until recently, because most of us have an inner monologue, a voice, and I get too much. I get intrusive thoughts and shit. I have my own words, like, distracting me in the background, my own responses to shower thoughts from 5 months ago. And then also, like, so when you close your eyes, you don't visualize images.
Nothing. No, absolutely nothing. Well, I didn't even realize, like, I didn't realize that wasn't everyone, because, like,
you don't know, you're not in other people's head. Yeah.
Well, that, and I'm a very, very, very solitary person. Like, I wake up, my girlfriend leaves for work at like 6:30 in the morning. My brother leaves for work at like 7. I don't leave I train in my garage most of the time. So I don't see a person from when I wake up till 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And it's just like, that's, and like in college, I didn't really have any friends. I never went to any parties. I just walked back and forth between my dorm, the gym, and the res hall. and or the dining hall, and so I never even like talked to anybody. And like I was talking to my girlfriend like a couple years ago, and she's like, "Oh yeah, like the words in your head." Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Words in your head?
Are you schizophrenic? No, but
Yeah,
the
I was
funny
like,
thing
dude.
is people that are thoroughly socialized don't know because it's not something people normally talk about. So we got into it with talking about things like autism when you look at like Temple Grandin and the unique ways that they visualize things, because the average person can conceptualize an apple to a degree, and some people are really good. You probably take artists or whatever, and it's perfect. Mine's a little fuzzy. I have a hard time staying on the same one, but you can kind of rotate it in your head. You can visualize it. When then you get somebody with autism, it's further down the spectrum to the point of savantism, and this is where you get like photographic memory, where people can conceptualize full scenes, like it gets really bizarre. But I think it's funny because it kind of pokes holes in how most people think their brain operates and who they are fundamentally. Because I experienced kind of a black, I would say a black curtain between my subconscious. I would say when I'm thinking, because I do get words, I do get pictures, but I am aware that even as I talk, a lot of it comes from like behind a veil that I don't really have access to, which is kind of bizarre and a little unsettling. And if a certain drugs will kind of pull that back a little bit. So like if I've ever taken like a little bit of an edible, which I have almost like a dozen times in my life, maybe I've taken THC, but all of a sudden it's like that veil gets pulled and it's like a fucking carnival in my brain, and it's the weirdest thing. So anyways, I mean, this is kind of an aside, but I think it's really fascinating how, I mean, because you're a normal functioning person, you're not a psychopath, right? You're not broken. It's just this main feature that we kind of take for granted that isn't shared, but obviously doesn't impact the way your brain forms thoughts. It's really interesting.
Have you ever gone to the website The Human Benchmark?
No, I'm gonna write that down.
It's just a silly little website that gives you like different like kinds of cognitive tests, like verbal memory, visual memory, reaction time, and then just gives you like what percentile you're in. Most definitely, the percentiles are probably skewed because the kind of person that seeks these things out is probably going to perform probably a bit above average on these different things. But whatever. I did it the other day, and I was like, it was a really interesting because like the verbal memory just like was like the easiest thing I've ever done, like straight to like 90th plus percentile on the first one. And then I did, the chimpanzee test where they show like numbers and then they hide the numbers and you have to click what order the numbers were in.
Okay. I know
it's a test that like chimps can perform like profoundly well at this thing, right?
Yeah.
Where it's just like they show you a bunch of randomly spaced numbers that are oriented randomly. You get however long you want to look at them and memorize them, and then they go blank and you have to click through them in the order. Third percentile. I couldn't do it.
That coincides because I want to say it's something like single digit percent of the population. I want to say it's like 2 or 3% has aphantasia, where they don't have that inner dialogue. They don't have that inner eye. Your mind's eye is what they refer to it. So it's crazy. And I feel like I could ask you 100 different thought experiments. Like, do you dream? Do you get visuals when you dream at all?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Well, the weird part is I mean, this is completely unrelated. I don't think I've slept for more than an hour straight in 10 years.
Interesting.
I don't have.
Man.
Yeah, I don't.
Somebody this is a case study. Somebody get a professional. We got to dig into this.
I don't have sleep apnea, but I wake up probably. Obviously, the numbers aren't me to believe, but like the Fitbit told me like 100 plus times a night, and that's all. Like I've never. People like are like, oh yeah, you close your eyes, you open them, and it's morning. And I was like, that has not happened to me once in my entire. Well, my dad's the same way, so it's like, I was like, maybe this is like a neural ramping thing from PEDs, like, and I was like, no, I was that way when I was like a 12-year-old. Like, I just can't sleep for more than like 10 minutes. I wake up. I sleep for like 20 minutes. I wake up.
And you're like conscious of every time you wake up throughout the night, like
100% alert. Like you could ask me a question, I can answer it. Like I've never woken up disoriented.
Because I know that my Fitbit shows like a billion little red dashes and I'm like, okay, I remember waking up like 4 times last night. So I was always a little worried because I tracked my sleep too. But yeah, the individual, the peculiarities of people, of how their body regulates and what they can get away with. Because again, like that seems like a highly dysfunctional sleep pattern, but you're alert, you're intelligent, you don't seem like, you were in Guantanamo Bay with people blaring metal music in your ears for 7 days straight, keeping you awake. So the fact that your body seems to adapt, I mean, obviously you're sufficiently recovered. That's interesting. I want to.
It kills me to think I could be better though. Because like, you know, it's like everybody you view as an authority tells you sleep is the quintessential thing. It's the best PED that isn't illegal, blah, blah, like all that shit. Right. And it's like, I have tried to leverage everything. Like I like deep diving stuff, like the same as you. And it's like, holy shit, I have tried to leverage everything people said for sleep.
I agree, but I think sufficient sleep, as you would define it, is probably defined by its consequences. And most people experience insufficient sleep as an inability to function. So the fact that you can do what you do, and I'm assuming, I don't know, do you walk around just feeling like dog shit all day, every day, like you can't form sentences? I've known people like that function based off like the skin of their teeth because their sleep's so bad and they're run ragged 18. Those are people that go into like fugue states because they're so exhausted. It's like a marathon runner at the end, just trying to get that next step. But you strike me as a high functioning individual. I would be very surprised if there was a lot to operate there. I mean, when you think of like people in the medical profession, people that are on call, people that, their general day to day is just being deprived. It shows itself in a pretty clear way.
What percentage of I guess I'll ask you this. What percentage of the day do you feel tired? Like you're like, I would describe how I feel as tired, right? Like obviously you're 10 plus years older than me, so it'll skew a little differently.
Man. Yeah, but no, so I would say in my productive years as an adult where I didn't have this crazy, blackout drunk. I was a borderline alcoholic for like 7 years. Blackout drunk 5 nights a week and, just finding the party and still finding time to train and doing okay. But like working at Pizza Hut and Domino's and not going to class at college. When I finally got my shit together and had a normal work schedule with daily benchmarks I had to hit, I became aware that I would get tired frequently, but that has to do with a lot of other things. My diet's a big one. I'm currently low carb. It's shitty for performance. I don't recommend anybody do it. For whatever reason, my biology, if I eat even a modest amount of carbs and sit down in front of a computer, in 20 minutes, I'm falling asleep. I can't keep my eyes open. It's like that 2 p.m. feeling from the 5-hour energy. I'm wiped out. And I notice that if the only thing I change is I remove carbohydrates, I don't get that at all throughout the day. So I don't know if that's some response to insulin. I mean, diabetes runs in my family. I don't know if that's related. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I find that my energy levels are static. So I don't really feel tired unless I've had a night where I'm like at 5 hours of sleep. And then by the end of the day, it's like, I'm going to hit my pillow. I'm going to wait, like you said, wake up the next morning. But 7 hours ish these days, I'm pretty good. Now, also recency effect. I'm thinking of the last 2 months. I've been on ADHD meds. Amphetamines have a funny way of just covering a lot of that. Which is something I'm trying to pay attention to and not use it as a crutch. I had like 3 hours of sleep the other night. I was still cruising the whole day, which is atypical. But paying attention to all of my years off of it, I would say I would normally have peaks and valleys throughout the day. But I know what being short of sleep is, and that's where like I'm running at 60% cognitive capacity. That's what that felt like to me.
Yeah, because I definitely don't fall to that margin where I'm like barely functioning, but I also it's crossed my mind. Like, I'm glad you're saying that like the ADHD meds can like be like a bit of an energy cover up, because that was an issue. My girlfriend who has ADHD and she's on meds for it, and that was the issue she ran into, was because she was able to get away with it. It gradually became a little bit more of a crutch, and like not aware of it, because during the day you're so functional and relatively alert that it's like you're building up. She basically just built up a sleep debt over a month to where it just like hit this breaking point that she had no idea was coming, and it was like terrible. Like, it was really bad.
Yeah, and I'm on this arc now with that, because I was never like, oh, ADHD isn't real, but I know, like, I've worked closely enough. The medical field's kind of a family profession. My father was a doctor. My wife works at a hospital as a social worker. I've worked very closely with doctors, ran groups with people that were involved in the medical communities at the gym. Anyways, enough about how the medical system is set up where you're never in the wrong for worrying about overdiagnosis or overprescription. There are a lot of gaps in our knowledge that exist. There's a lot of things that are like, well, this is the best we know, so let's do this. But somebody has an incentive to sell it to you as if, no, we know absolutely, stop asking questions. Long story short, it was hard for me to make that leap because the standards I held for myself and my doubts and uncertainty. So I'm on the one hand, like, okay, there's a thing that needs to be addressed, and we have what seems to be a really good way of addressing it. On the other hand, there's no such thing as a free cookie. And just like every other technology we have in society, as soon as somebody gives you something that's supposed to 10x your productivity, our engagement with it immediately goes down, and so does our productivity. You know, it's like, I mean, this is kind of on a tangent, but think of in middle school, I don't know, maybe when you were in middle school, maybe it was already too late by then. But when I was in middle school and you had to write an essay, you had to go to the library, spend 4 or 5 hours reading and finding sources. And we were educated on the Dewey Decimal System. Now we have this amazing, brilliant machine that spits out anything we ever want. Now we have ChatGPT, and I can ask questions and get like a person answering it in real time. And people don't click on the second page of Google. You know what I mean? So I think about it the same way. This technology that should do something and does something, you still have to stay on top of it, and paying attention to shit like that is important. Like, you're not going from broken to fixed. It's like, this is a tool that I'm using to get a result. I have to engage with it and be responsible. And it's hard to do that with masses of people. How long has she been on?
Couple of years now. It's been on and off because she's gone through the same, like, she was getting sleep disturbances, so it's like, oh, maybe this is the net negative, right? It's been like it's been a very, very weird process, because when she was a teenager, she was diagnosed as like bipolar, but the less bad of the two, right? But like the symptoms didn't really match. It was really just probably a very poor diagnosis, and so she functioned like 4 years under the assumption that the issue she was having was because she was bipolar, and like the whole thing of like, oh, ADHD might be obviously more present in men, but also underdiagnosed in women if it presents differently, and like what clinicians are looking for. So it's been this whole ongoing thing. Who the fuck knows if she even has ADHD? Like, all we know is that her productivity has gotten better, and she's able to function in day-to-day life better. Like you said, it's a step in the right direction, and then you got to take the following steps. You just get a nice little help, like easy first one. But yeah, it's been a who the hell knows. I've been really, 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 as someone, I've never been on any meds for anything. I haven't been to a doctor since I was like 10, because my parents split, and they forgot about the whole like getting shots.
Low priority.
I haven't been to a dentist since I was like 13. Like, I'm off the grid. So but I've been like profoundly unimpressed by the help that she's gotten. Part of that's like, obviously we live here in Montana. You don't exactly have the pick of the litter in terms of like clinicians to work with. But the level of lack of research, and like at one point she was on lithium, and they weren't having her get regular blood tests, even though excess lithium buildup, it can kill you. It's like been the least impressive thing. And it's really, really made me question things a little bit about like, how systematized this actually is. And I'm sure there's great clinicians. It's like coaching, right? I'm sure a new athlete would be under the perception that there is a correct way to coach, and that it's systematized, and that a good coach follows these systems. And it's like, nope, most coaches are actually just flying by the seat of their pants, make it like, oh, we're deloading this week. It's like, did you just come up with that? You're charging for this? And that's the majority.
We are, and this is something we have to reckon with societally, because it always goes back to the big picture. And this parallels very closely my gripes with exercise.
I'm gonna get in trouble for mentioning this on the podcast.
Yeah, no, this is it's very similar, because every science wants itself to be treated as if it's physics, as if we have this one-to-one correlation. We did a study, figured out this mathematical algorithm that's perfect, that describes what we see, and now we have complete predictability. And we're all based in physics, right? And we're all made of physical materials that are knowable. But once you get to a certain amount of complexity, or once you get to subjective ideas that have to be operationalized, like, how do you define happiness? How do you define sadness in a way that lets you accurately diagnose depression? It has to be operationalized a different way. So you get further and further away from that one-to-one point of truth. And the types of studies we do end up being less and less sharp, and you can't pull as much conclusiveness from it. But because these are all individual academic fields, and that's not to say they don't have value, they absolutely do, but you cannot pull the same level of predictability out of something like social science or even psychology as you can out of what people consider harder sciences. And if you go in not knowing that or not addressing that, you get really, really bad fucking results. And I think it really is a human bias of wanting to represent yourself as an authority. If you are an authority, wanting people not to ask questions, kind of feeling like you have it figured out. and that's a really dangerous thing. I'm a big fan of Dr. K. It's like Healthy Gamer, but he streams on YouTube. Really
Yeah,
good.
my girlfriend loves that guy.
Oh, he's great. I just found him not that long ago. He's really good. My father was a psychiatrist, so I got inundated to like the speak early on. And a whole other aside, subsequently for my father, he also had an addiction problem, but we ended up in this like kind of Al-Anon type group thing for a year with my mom. And it was one of the most, I was 13, one of the most transformative times of my life, learning about the thing that people pretend to know about today, like boundaries and codependency and personality disorders and all that. But I don't know why that's not part of middle school. Anyways, it's such an important transformative thing with how you relate to other people and how you evaluate yourself. But long story short, what Dr. K said that stuck with me and that I've kind of known before, he's like, yeah, there's very good clinicians out there. There's also a lot of bad ones because care is required. Subtlety is required. You can experiment with medicines, but people dump it out. It's almost like the uncertainty, same with training, gives you the ability to kind of check out.
Well, I think inherently to be a good clinician, there's a high demand for just fundamental people skills that isn't rewarded in school, right? Like the person that does the best in school is on the best track to become the best doctor at the best, or the best clinician at the best place. It's like, wow, you've never been fundamentally tested on just basic communicational skills. And it's like, your job is fundamentally human communication.
I have a massive chip on my shoulder for professionals that feel like they're not obligated to make their ideas understandable to other people. And that's so huge.
I'm fine with doctors, whatever. You went through med school. I fucking hate coaches that use like biomechanical jargon talking to gen pop people.
Yes.
You don't sound smart. You sound like a fucking idiot who's trying, like you're like that kid in class who's like, am I correct in assuming? And then they just like say what the teacher already said to like flex that they understand. The teacher goes, yes, that's correct. Dude, you don't look smart. You look really stupid and insecure. Like the number of coaches that refuse to speak in like layman terms to lay people and think that makes them somehow a better coach kills me. And they got this superiority complex over people that talk in normal language. And they're like, well, technically, and it's like, I'm not talking technicality. It's like, it's the same thing when we're praising a cue, right? There is not really necessarily such a thing as a good cue and a bad cue. It entirely depends on how it's interpreted and implemented by the athlete. But so that's a bad cue, because if they do that literally, most people aren't doing it literally, right? You're not ripping the floor apart, you jackass. Like it just depends how it's interpreted. Like, yeah, so there's definitely some cues out there that on average, the interpretation is probably going to yield to like a technical fault, right? Like I think probably over time, chest up has been kind of put away as like the predominant cue for squatting, because it just leads to people thinking that squatting in like rampant extension is correct, right? It's like, if we're going to say chest up, we need to pair that with say like, hey, let's say ribs down, chest up. Let's see if that kind of creates the upper back tightness we're looking for. But maybe it wouldn't be like necessary. I wouldn't be impressed if that was someone's first cue with no extra info. But it doesn't mean it's a bad cue, because I've seen athletes be like, yeah, no, that fixed my squat. That can't
everybody
be a bad cue.
responds to it differently. Yeah, but that's the point, is that you're a coach, you're trying to take abstract ideas, analogies, different ways of thinking to almost trick people into moving the way you want them to. And you have to be in their head. You have to know what they are feeling. One of the reasons I get pissed off about the glute activation drama is because you have people that are being overly literal, that are worried about this thing being technically incorrect. I've worked with people that don't know what push your hips forwards mean. I've worked with people that don't know how to clench their ass. When you're at a meet and they're stuck on a squat and you're yelling hips or glutes, they physically don't know what that means. And same thing with your triceps. I remember the first time I did tricep press downs and then benched after, I'm like, is that what I should be feeling while I'm benching? There's something actively there grabbing instead of just push forward, but that's all it is. And then to take it back to the medical field, I mean, I do have an extra chip on my shoulder with doctors specifically, because the inability to take the most obnoxious jargon that's essential in your field, but not to be able to draw that bridge to other people. There's people that are terrified because their family members are getting diagnosed with cancer. They don't know what their treatment options are. And hospitals are already a bureaucratic nightmare. And to not be able to clearly, concisely say, this is what's wrong with you, this is what the prognosis is, these are the treatments we're going to consider, this is what your next step is, and we went through that with my mother-in-law. We lost her to cancer. And I remember the lack of communication. I mean, the doctor was like, it was like talking to Mr. Spock. And there was just no bridge between these. This is what you need to know. This is the information I have. And it's like, that's fine if you're behind the scenes, just turning knobs. But it's like, yeah, that basic human skill. And I also really doubt that people like that, excuse me, have as much expertise that they would otherwise if they could communicate, because that means that's been a barrier their entire life. And that's a lot of interaction they haven't been getting with their professors, their peers, and other people. It's just been rote information. If you have that barrier to basic communication, that means you're also not getting the same input, which I think is a problem.
Yeah, well, it's tricky, right? Because it's just like, you know, to tie back to like the glute activation argument, it's like on one level, yeah, why are we getting hung up on semantics, right? If something's practically actionable, it's awesome, right? But it's like, on the other hand, like I think we can both remember back to a time when people would just say things like, yes, your conclusion is probably decent, but you're just giving people really, really false ways of getting there, why it's doing this, right? Like, why is the lat useful in the deadlift, right? Is the lat important in the bench press, right? People used to claim it was a primary mover. Right. I remember to this day, people adamantly swearing the lat was a primary mover in the bench press. That doesn't mean it's not important. Right. And that we shouldn't train it. Right. So it's like the conclusions there. And that's one I got an interesting perspective on, because the gym I train at when I drive into town is like a very kind of lifter oriented, heavily evidence based PT clinic. Right. Where a lot of the people they rehab are power lifters. And I'm sure I've got a hunch you've got some gripes with them. Right, where it's like the true pain science guys, there's no proof anything does anything. I'll bat down 1,000 claims and just never make one of my own. The guys who work there are great. So it's like I've been able to like talk to them and say like, hey, can we change? Like, can we not be like this? Right. It's like at some point, like, yes, there's no evidence to support anything, but we should probably do something. Right. And it's like, I've gotten into that where it's like, I need to be careful because I don't want someone like reporting back to them that I said, activate your glutes. Right. It's like, I'll either always use my fancy little quotation marks because people are in the know are going to understand what I mean. And it's like, if I'm breaking it down in a video, maybe I'll say, hey, look, I'm just trying to get a light pump to the glutes. That way I've got kind of a better proprioceptive feel because I want to utilize. Yeah, I would like to utilize them better within this motor pattern. I'm not saying they're off. I'm not saying they're not contributing to the squat. I'm saying that there's something I could cue and do beforehand that would let me move in the way that I think is going to yield the best. Like, we're not even talking good form, bad form. I'm just saying for me, I have a theory. This is going to, I'm not saying it's inherently injurious not to do this. I have a hunch this is going to yield me a better competitive outcome. And if I do some kind of work beforehand, that light pump sensation allows me to kind of find them and cue them into my lift a little bit better. We can get into that, how, I'm just not saying it's activated or deactivated. It's just a proprioceptive thing. But when you're talking to lay people, it's like, I kind of get there's no harm in saying activate, you know, yeah, probably it's technically not. Yeah, they understand the gist of what you're getting at, but it's like, yeah, then they go talk to other people and that's how misinformation spreads. It's like what you mentioned in the questionnaire is like, what level of obligation do we have to be technically accurate versus what level of obligation do we have to give things that are practically actionable, and what level of obligation do we have, period? Because I think that ruins content. The more you're viewed as an authority figure, the less you can speak as a person. Because it's like people like content where you're speaking genuinely as a human being, right? And if I say, yeah, this exercise fucking sucks, I'm wrong. That exercise doesn't suck. It's got these use cases. I could go into those in detail, but that's not me interacting authentically as I would as a person, right? So people are pushed away from talking like they would as a normal person and having to make these robotical many if-then statements, and the content gets a little shitty because of it. And that's why I think like one of many reasons people really like Sam Sulik's channel is he's not convinced he's an authority figure. He's convinced he's just a guy who's going to continue talking like just a guy, and just to say like, hey, yeah, maybe my form isn't optimal, but I think training hard matters. And it's like, yeah, people are going to take that, they're going to go implement it, and it's going to work for them. And they're like, this guy's the fucking truth. He's not making all these vague if-then statements. And it's like, yeah, fair enough. I understand the appeal, and I wish I could interact a little bit more authentically. But on some level, like, I am accountable for what I say on a platform that's rewatchable over and over and over, and people view as informative content. Like, I don't think of myself as an educator. I'm some fucking dude that lives in Three Forks, Montana, that lifts weights. And I started making videos because I didn't have any friends to talk to lifting weights about. So I talked to a camera explaining how I thought that like orienting your accessory work this way worked pretty good. And it's kind of evolved into what it is now. I'm not a fucking educator. Like I'm an idiot. I put all my eggs into a really dumb, a really objectively stupid basket, and I'm cutting years off my life because I think the big numbers are cool.
That's the best educator, though. It's one that's self-aware, and you understand that there isn't a perfect application of information. There's some things we have a pretty good idea about, and the only way you can speak authentically and accurately is to give the most specific advice you can that's hedged by the things we don't know. And that's the best anyone can do. And I think intelligent, thoughtful people who also are engaged in a practical discipline. I think of the workman-like methods used by somebody in a trade. It's like, just because we don't have, like, science doesn't go away because we don't have a peer-reviewed study to look at. That is not the gold standard of how we know things in every field. It's great if we have that, assuming we have the funding, the access to subjects or experimentation, and all of the advanced methods of evaluating all that information to where we can get really clear stuff. That's great if we have that. But people figured out how to farm long before, something like a college existed. People figured out how to predict the weather or the seasons. People figured out how to engage with their lives and get a better result. And in fields where there's a lot of variability, where we know some things really well, but specific things like maybe, but if this, then that, intuition comes into play. It gets treated like a discipline. I mean, I always use the example of, lifting. It's not that different than like martial arts. Like, show me the study that is going to help somebody be a UFC fighter. It's a discipline.
Yeah, be an evidence-based fighter. Good fucking luck with that. Yeah.
Completely. It's like, do we pretend that there's no discipline? There's no kind of objective discovery of principles that give better results because we don't have this thing? Certain fields, because of the way we're handicapped, that discipline-like method of establishing things at work, it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's infinitely better than pretending like we can't say anything if it didn't come out of a college campus, because it's like, Jesus, I could spend all day like ripping colleges, and it's not, again, not to say that they don't have value. They do have value, but things that have nuggets of truth, it's not that they're right or wrong. Right shit can go really sideways when you overrepresent what it is. And anyways, it's
I think you hit the nail on the head, that it's overrepresenting what we have data on, right? It's like, if you're an evidence-based, like, let's say you view yourself as like a science communicator in the lifting field. I'm not talking about Dr. Mike. I think he actually does a pretty decent job. I'm talking about a lot of other people. But if you're a science communicator and you're representing what we have literature on, generally speaking, people overrepresent to what degree we understand mechanics as athletes get more advanced. There's no funding for what works to drive up your bench press past like the beginner phase. Like, yes, we're doing studies that give us good understandings of basic physiology, and we can take those and extrapolate those upward, because a lot of things about physiology don't change, but some things about physiology do change, right? Just like how anybody who's worth their salt says training changes as you aren't a beginner, right? Effective programming must change as well. And there just aren't studies on training for advanced athletes. There's no funding, there's no interest. So at that point, we have to use different data sets outside of what's been done in a purely academic setting. Like an evidence, what is it? Like an evidence of absence, or like an absence of evidence is, whatever.
Yeah, it's not evidence of absence. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, cool. We don't have, like, I agree, we don't have the highest form of evidence. If we're going to place that as the highest form of evidence, like, yeah, for some stuff we do. It's not up for debate. Like if we were talking about like some simple chemistry question, yes, we're going to look to peer-reviewed evidence. That's the highest form of evidence. And your anecdotal experience, I don't care, right? Because it's been studied multiple times rigorously, right? When we have no studies, that doesn't speak at all to what the actual like truth, whatever the fuck, whatever the truth is. It speaks to what gets funded for studies, right? So we need to look to what's the next best level of evidence, right? To me, that would be a longtime coach that's implementing the scientific method, right? Yeah, like you said, science doesn't stop at academia. The scientific method is a thought process. So yeah, some coaches are absolutely not scientific in their approach. But to me, okay, as soon as we get past that level of like, okay, we don't have like a good peer-reviewed study, and hey, we don't have one of those cool Russian studies that were like observational studies on high-level lifters. Those are fucking cool. But we don't have any of those on the powerlifting, right? Then we have to look to, like, let's say a coach who's been very scientific in his methods, and he's got a bigger data set than just N is 1. Which a lifter can do. They can be a very intelligent lifter, But at the end of the day, if they're not a coach and they're all they're concerned with is them getting better, and that more power to them. That's what makes them great. But their data set is too small. So I would look to like a conglomeration of coaches sharing knowledge. They've got a combined, let's say, lifters of 500. Then, okay, yes, it's not the highest form of evidence, but it's the highest we've got, right? And it's like, okay, that's where that discussion needs to happen, and that information can be put out there, not as absolute fact, but as the best guess we've got, right? It's also tricky, right? Because you don't always listen to the big guy. Sometimes the big guy is really stupid and is where he is despite everything he's doing, right? I like to give people a little bit more credit than that, because I think some people are smart and just not articulate. And some people, like, I don't think I'm particularly smart. I think I just speak somewhat well, and people think I'm a lot smarter than I am, right? But I think that like some athletes, they don't articulate themselves well, and they don't have a high coaching IQ. You give them an athlete, all they know is to, here's what worked for me. But their IQ as an athlete is through the roof. They have whether it's intuition or like cognitive thought, they have a tremendous feel for what exactly needs to be done to have them ready by contest day. It's not just it's not just this idiot and his genius coach behind the scenes. Like, people don't give Max enough credit. Max has Max can't coach worth a shit. He tried, because he was like, oh, Sam, you're doing coaching and that way you can lift, right? Maybe I'll try that. We tried it. He didn't. He's like, oh man, if my athletes aren't going to put forward their best effort, why would I give mine? Like, that's kind of the athlete's perspective. I bust my ass. Why aren't you? Right. And it's just like, it didn't click with how he thinks about things. And he was also just like, here's what works for me. Right. And it's like, he's got a tremendous feel for, he was at the time, he was the youngest guy to ever pull 800 in competition when he was 19. And he's like, just squatted his first 350 kilos. He's 21 years old. He's like on this tremendous trajectory to be a great super heavyweight powerlifter. And that's been this drawn out, slow, each year his total goes up since he was 11 years old and we started training him. Right. And it's like, that's not me being a genius. That's me giving a basic framework of how not to fucking hurt yourself, and him implementing a very, very high athlete's IQ. So sometimes some guys hop on podcasts and people are like, oh man, that's crazy. He just must be all genetics. He wasn't articulate at all about his process. He doesn't practice articulating his process. He practices doing it, And it's like, I think some people have a really bad feel for which guys are where they are despite, and which guys just don't necessarily present it really well. Like, I've always felt John Hack, I think, intentionally sells himself short on his efforts. And I think that's his thing, because it's like, it's a cool look to be the guy who like isn't trying and is the best in the world. But he admits himself, he's like, I go to like one rave a year. I just post it because it looks good. You know what I mean? Like, and it's like, I think he downplays like how much thought he puts into his process. There's other guys that I'm like, my intuition is telling me you're trying really hard, but you're not actually like necessarily have that huge athlete's IQ. Right. So it's tricky, right? Because it's like, especially you and I have been doing this for a long time. We can kind of get a feel, and maybe I've been wrong about people. I'm sure you've been wrong about people where you thought this guy was a freak. You're like, fuck, you're smart. I should have given you more credit. Right. It's like, I've been wrong about plenty of people, but you get a better feel. And I feel bad for newer lifters, because it's like, these guys both have the same competitive result. This guy there's a guy on YouTube, I'm not going to say his name, that I really don't like. And it's like, you can present things in really neat packages that this is how training works. It's these square numbers of ratios and all this, right? And that's how it works. And you're like, oh, this guy's a fucking genius. And then you have this guy who's like, oh man, it really depends. Like, what's worked for me is this, but like, I've seen other guys do this. And you're like, oh, that guy's not confident at all. He's not the smart one. It's like, no, you've got that backwards.
All the best resources. And I mean, you mentioned Dr. Mike. He's a perfect example of this. I'm attracted innately to people who have something to say that, again, is they know the point they're trying to make, but they are immediately, as they're making it, implementing the restrictions, the counter to the rule, because that is all the context that matters that most people miss. Israel does that every time he opens all of his little presentations with his PowerPoints. Everything is like the way it's true and the way it's not true. Do this, but also know all of this. We think we know this, but also and everything is hedged back and forth that way. And also, one of the things that kind of warmed me up a little bit to the people in exercise science is, like, I listened to like a Brad Schoenfeld interview or something, and he's very good at saying, hey, don't overrepresent what the conclusion of this study tells us. This is not something that's meant to inform training. It's literally not what they're there for. If you're looking at studies and pulling out one-to-one training information, you're doing it wrong. And the guys with the PhDs that have to write all the sources of error in every lab class they've ever taken, that have to, their study is going to have their name on it. And if it's not up to snuff, it's going to get ripped apart, or if they overrepresent it by the community. Those are the people that tend to do that. It's some of the other people that, and not going to name names, it's somebody we mentioned in this podcast, but there's other people that like to take,
oh geez,
they like to take the PubMed articles and read it and post it on TikTok and then inform everybody how, it's been shown so well that this one thing is true, that, a study that was based off, 10 dipshits in this group, 10 dipshits in that group. 6 weeks later, oh my God, there's this disparity in results. Hey, let me go tell this IFBB bodybuilder how he'd be doing better if he, cut his workload in half or something like that. And it gets really, really bizarre the way that people implement this stuff. I have a really cynical view, though, on exercise science, because you mentioned the funding. There's also incentive. There's like no stakes here. We know what makes a good NFL player, and it's not going to be somebody figuring out how to bench 50 pounds more going into it. You know what I mean? Like, we're at the limit, I think, where athletes need to be, and where you're fighting things out is really on like recovery ability or what their genetic package is, if you really want to push the limits. And in addition to that, even if we had all the funding in the world, there aren't enough people to participate in the studies to ask the types of questions you would need to, because the flow chart of if this, then that is so impossibly large that it would require everybody participating in studies at all time. Maybe we'll get to like quantum computers that can run simulations, 1 billion per second for specific genome types, and we can start to learn things that way. But again, like, what's the incentive? Is the world going to be better off?
You got to keep your hopes high, though. I mean, we have an obesity epidemic, so there's some level of incentive to invest in fitness research. And it's like, yeah, we go 30 years back. There's a lot of things that people would be, oh, what are you, an idiot? That's not ever going to happen. And it's like, it only took 30 years. So I think you got to, you have to, I think this is something that, like, I was more cynical actually when I was in school and I was like assisting in research. I was like, wow, this is fucking dumb. Yeah, right.
Let me specify really quick what I meant, because like you're absolutely right. There's aspects where there's going to be a lot of application and a lot of use, but I'm talking about what's the incentive to get so good at strength programming that we can predictably say, because this is what's limiting us. Every physicist has to say, okay, this is what we know. This is what we're trying to prove. We're limited by our equipment, our technology, our ability to measure. They know what's holding them back. The thing holding exercise science back from any new paradigm shift is being able to predict, hey, you, with your genetic type, we know exactly how you respond to training. We know exactly what your trajectory should be. We know exactly the decisions you should be making. And we have the perfect trajectory that's evidence-based, based on everything we know to be true about you. And that's going to be in service of pushing your limit forward 5 or 10% more. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, we don't have an incentive to do that.
But I don't think we necessarily, like, I think we have to look at, like, I don't think it's any worse for us than any other sport. Like, I don't think cycling is maybe the one exception because it's so physiology dependent that it's like these studies on like rates of glucose uptake and lactate clearance. Like, cycling is such a low skill, like physiology based sport that, like, I think actually it does matter for them. But like, let's zoom out and say other sports, like, generally speaking, the science is kind of following behind the cutting edge. And I think as long as we view that as its role of fact checking these things that we've taken as givens, and like that might be the paradigm shift is, holy shit, nutrient partitioning from when you're leaner, that's not a real thing. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying like that, I don't think we're going to see a big paradigm shift outside of saying, hey, there are some principles that we've observed and kind of accepted as coaches to be facts. Then maybe we catch up a couple years later and say, oh shit, this basis for what we've built upon has changed a little bit. And that's the kind of paradigm shift I think we could actually see, is like, you have these great minds in exercise science. And like, don't get me wrong, I just try to be nice because some of my friends are real exercise, like actually they are in research from when I was in college. And like, they're so optimistic about it. I don't want to be a douche and just be like, this shit's fucking useless. Right. But it's like, at the same time, you have these people who are invested. There's not that many of them and they don't have that much funded, but they're working really hard. And it's like, as long as we view that function, it's like, okay, we've got the cutting edge of what coaches are speculating is working, and there's just no interest in funding. And then we have this kind of vacuum finding where we fucking messed up and where we missed as the people who are like a little bit further down the towards the advanced athlete spectrum. Right. And it's like, we've already had some, right? Like there were all the good coaches, if we rewind 20 years, would swear by the fact that time under tension was a valuable training metric and it held value, right? So far, it really doesn't look like that in particular is all that valuable of a training metric for hypertrophy or for strength, right? And it's like, who knows? Maybe 5 years from now, turns out the bros were right again. Haha, like the usual, like, oh, looks like you can train upper and lower abs. Fuck, we were bullying you guys for no reason. You were right. But it's like, there's a chance it doesn't get overturned. And that was something that, like, otherwise we would have continued saying that time under tension was this super useful training metric. And then we've got these time under tension sets. And it's like, yeah, that's going to bleed into advanced athletes because that's time that could be like, yeah, for the general fitness enthusiast, doesn't matter, right? It's like still hard work against resistance that progresses with time. So it's like whether the time under tension was the reason that set was valuable or not doesn't matter, but it does affect the high performers that are trying to leverage everything they can to its utmost. So it's like, yeah, I think it can have like trickle up effect. It's not trickle down like people like to present it as, where the science leads and the big dumb athletes follow. No, it trickles up in changing small foundational things that we build our programming understanding on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Geez, like thinking about it in that way, when I think about what is limited, because okay, we have these things that are catching up, and they have a certain potential to change the field. Some based on general trainees to some degree, but probably not that much. But as you said, to people that are more specialized that need every little bit. I'm wondering what the ability is though for a paradigm shift like that to affect how big somebody can be on a bodybuilding stage. Like, is that going to be the thing that lets somebody go from 300 to 315? Maybe not.
No, right? But that's the thing, right? So what you just said, if you ask any bodybuilder, is a crazy margin of difference, right? But it's like the margin between first and second is like 0.01%, right? So it's enough to so it might not be enough to change to the layperson the outcomes, but it can change the competitive placings because we know in the grand scheme of things, those are very niche. So it's like if someone's spending like even just 1 out of 10 sets is kind of misguided in what driver of hypertrophy they're trying to emphasize. Yeah, sure. No, it's not going to make bodybuilding. We're not going to have this big paradigm shift where guys get way bigger, right?
Yeah.
But it can maintain a competitive advantage and thus is relevant. It's interesting because it's only relevant to people who are competing with other people in that upper 0.1%.
Which is not how it gets presented, right? Because the thing, I think the thing that people expect is that, oh my God, if we just get enough articles together and can dissect the information, that we got 50% more that we can expect on the top end. And that's kind of where the cynicism comes from, because sorry, my ADHD is kicking. I don't know why I'm playing with a ruler.
You're good.
We're at the point where it's like we're at diminished returns, and there's one of two things. There could be something we're missing that kicks us back up, or it could really be that we're on this asymptotic trajectory where we're kind of it. And that's where the incentive is, because how much effort is academia going to push towards working at those margins? And also the misrepresentation, because the average person doesn't know or doesn't think like the way you just described it. So they're more incentivized to go try to look at all of this stuff that potentially isn't, I would say in all likelihood, isn't going to be nearly as good as doing what people have generally done for the last century or so, and finding an entry point. And then so much of it has to be trial and error, because the things that athlete IQ you talked about, the way you make decisions in response to your own biology, infinitely more important than anything you've ever read as far as a training heuristic or a study or anything,
or even
else.
Honestly, even if I'm being perfectly honest, like even programming it, like that's something I've always thought was funny, is people are like, oh my God, it's crazy that this guy is so strong and he's still just using 5-3-1. But it's like, if you give someone with a tremendous amount of experience, they understand how to leverage their outside the gym variables towards like a certain physiological outcome, and you say, hey, I'm going to have you do 5 sets of 5, but I'm going to allow you some level of auto regulation. That athlete is going to be able to milk 5x5s. Like, oh, maybe I'm going to do ramping sets at first, then straight sets, then top set back offs. I can auto regulate to an RPE. Like you said, there's some level of intuition I have of what level is needed to touch today to be more prepared for next week. They can take that, it's just a static rep range. It's not even a program. I just told them do 5 sets of 5. But if you have a really experienced athlete who has a good athlete's IQ, they can milk that to infinity. JF Caron just does 5x5s. Like, then he adds in a top single and does a back off 3x5. That's like his whole program. There isn't periodization there other than the proximity at which the top singles added it, right? But that's not to just say he's some genetic freak that's doing 5x5s the same way Jimmy is with his 140 5x5 bench. So it's like, holy shit, programming even becomes slightly less relevant when the athlete has this great ability to auto-regulate and has a good intuitive sense for what is needed to drive me to where I need to be the next week. And how many times do I need to do that to be at this point for the competition? And it's like, you can take some pretty rudimentary schemes and apply a crazy athlete's IQ to it and make it work. Now, obviously in a perfect world, you give them like reasonably periodized training on top of their athlete's IQ, and they get to see really drawn out continual success, right? But it's like, fucking A, the programming probably isn't the problem as much as I think that's the most interesting part.
That's completely it. And our limited ability, I think, to engage with language and to assign very precise meaning to the words and descriptions we use is a big problem, because we have this concept of what programming is, and it's this catch-all. And you think that if a bunch of people are running a template, a protocol, whatever, that they must all be on the same page because, hey, the split and the percentages and whatever is all the same. But one program can be many, many different programs depending on how the individual applies themselves to it. And it can make really, really great use out of something that's kind of rudimentary or even shitty. And it can make really horrendous use out of something that's completely dialed in. And you see that everywhere you go. I mean, consider if anybody's had surface level introduction to Olympic lifting and seen how Olympic lifting is structured, it doesn't follow the same assumptions that powerlifting or bodybuilding style training does. It's skill work, and doses of stress are skill practices, touches, repetitions, not, effective reps or, how much quote unquote stress did you handle? It's you do a lot of touches today, maybe less touches tomorrow. Maybe you have a big week with a lot of touches. Maybe you have a week that's medium or small, and that ebb and flow over time as you adjust the weight leads you to better outcomes. It's entirely skill dependent.
Well, I think weightlifting also, because of that, is a better base for strongman programming than being proficient in powerlifting programming, because you have this idea of like, okay, we've got skills, these are the events, right? We've got general events that we know are frequent, and then as soon as we sign up for a specific event, we've got this idea of specificity, and then we have these general physical qualities, just like how it's not like the weightlifting coach is unfamiliar with how to increase your back squat. They know, okay, well, here are the developmental lifts that are done in the background for that strongman while also getting their skill touches. And it's like, that was a foundational thing that I had to like rework, is like, no, it's not necessarily about building percentages and volumes with the yoke. It's skill touches, and how many skill touches you're doing per week goes up, down, depending on what you're trying to do. And I definitely think that weightlifting programming translates to figuring out figuring out strongman programming better than a powerlifting background does.
Completely, because it's not like bodybuilding and physical development training is focused on fatigue or strain or whatever, and it's not based on that. And that's not only valuable, that can be in certain phases more valuable and more appropriate. But when you look at Olympic lifting for how long it's been around, the amount of investigation, still the backbone of a lot of sports training is shit the Soviets did over 50 years ago, that hasn't been reproduced or questioned, but we still throw it out there. But you get this sense of like this high-minded, very complex mathematical approach to training. But then you look at the Bulgarian system, and it's wildly different. It's like, and just
it's still performing within, let's just say 1%, right? And who gives a fuck what the percent is? But like, it's like, yes, maybe these more high-minded systems, slightly better, obviously, less people, like less bodies left in the wake of the program, sure. Yeah. But in terms of producing medals, like, it's just 1% behind. And it's like, that's what you're gaining from this high-minded structure, right? It's also tricky, right? Because it's like, when I was getting into powerlifting when I was younger, I felt like I was an alien, right? Because I would go on like these forums to learn about lifting weights. And it's the only sport that I had ever been in where telling someone the way to get better is to try hard was considered a stupid answer. That blew I was so confused, because I felt, I'm like, yeah, man, I'm coming from a really rigorous background. Like I'm a bit of a weirdo. I've just been constantly, I haven't deloaded in 12 years. Like I just have trained my body as much as my body will let me train. It's probably why I sleep bad now that I think about it. Is like, I'm like, oh, I can't remember sleeping well. Well, yeah, I walked into a boxing gym when I was 9 and have been doing like 2-a-day training since then without a week off. So maybe I'm just chronically towing that edge of overtraining. And that's why I sleep bad, but I'm durable and adaptable. So I've gotten away with it. Right. But I was like, it was always a thing in every sport I played, practice harder. The guys who are good aren't because they're doing like we do the same practice as a team. Like my gym does the same workout. And the guys that are good did the drills harder. It wasn't that they were doing the drills in a different order or in different quantities. They were doing the exact same general workout as me.
Yeah.
Our workout, as far as I knew, was as good as any other gym. So I applied that to lifting. I'm like, I've got a plan. I don't think the specifics of the plan. I've realized later the specifics of the plan matter more. But I was like, I've got a plan. It's probably about as good as anybody else's plan. So what I'm going to do is just like how I'm going to go harder on our sparring rounds, and I'm going to beat him on the road work. I'm going to beat him on this. And that's why I'm going to beat this guy, right? Is everything we're all both doing is the jump rope. I'm going to push myself harder. So I came into powerlifting and I was like, oh, I'm just going to work harder on my tricep extensions. I'm going to work harder on my pec flies. Obviously, I kind of had some semblance of an idea that technique mattered because it matters in combat sports. And so I was like, oh, we're all doing probably the same routine. The guys who are winning, obviously genetics exist, are the ones who are executing that routine with more intensity. And so I go on these forums and like I would talk to people, which was a massive mistake. And they would tell me I was just some genetically blessed idiot. And I was like, you guys are training like pussies. I'm going to be honest here. Like I backed off my aggressiveness with my lingo as I've gotten older because I realized that arguing on the internet is for idiots. But that being said, I was like, this is crazy. You guys are all speculating that the problem is the order of your exercises, or like you're just not doing them hard, which was so foreign to me because that was such an obvious, like a boxing coach would never hesitate to tell you you're just being a bitch and that's why you're not getting the most out of our training.
Well, working hard, it fills in so many gaps by accident. And part of that is just the way that our biology adapts. And part of it is also it keeps us engaged. We're probably more likely to solve problems that we otherwise wouldn't if we were more engaged. Where on the other hand, if you're not working hard, you're assuming that everything else is perfect to make up the gap, which it never is. So you have this catch-all that comes from working hard. Another example that kind of mirrors that, as far as like one system actually being a lot more pliable and a lot more different than people think. You have like a lot of the cult of West Side people. The more I've talked to people that have been part of that system, either directly in the original spot or outside of it in some way, the more you realize that West Side doesn't mean anything except the most loose structure of, well, we change exercises and go heavy on this day. And then, we do this thing called speed work. And then, we do bodybuilding isolation stuff at the end, and it breaks down very quickly because even in house, like a lot of the people said, like the best guys did their own thing. Like they picked their accessories. They had all kinds of different approaches to building up weak areas. The percentage or how many reps they did on max effort was different. Talking to Dave Tate, he even talked about speed work. The reason Louis ended up having to go back on speed work and start programming volume after like their heyday in like, I guess like early 2000s was because the specific way, according to Dave, the specific way that speed work worked on those days was the hatred between all of the competitors that fueled them to use so much compensatory acceleration. You talked about coasting earlier on bench, right? Based on the momentum. They used so much compensatory acceleration on this lift and kept the rest period so short, and oftentimes ended up slapping more weight than they were supposed to use.
I was going to say that, it sounds like that was like a staple, and it's like, oh, that's just a completely different workout. I got it.
He described it as, because I was like, well, everything addresses specificity differently. If you're in West Side, it's a max effort day because the specificity is grinding for one rep. And then, the rest, you pin that thing to the wall and everything else moves. He's like, no, the speed work was the most specific thing. I'm like, the fucking speed work, because in his mind, that was closest to the competition movement pattern. And they used so much damn intensity that they got a lot out of it. And he's like, yeah. And once we left and the group change, he's like, Louis couldn't get the guys to work hard enough to get anything out of it. And I'm like, you talk about validating moments. I'm like, damn it. Like, I've been telling everybody forever that taking 60% and doing a bunch of quick reps isn't doing shit for you. And then you come to find out that there are so many specific parameters that made it productive that even the highest authority in the world, the inventor of the system, couldn't make it work for guys that did not have that dog in them. And it just highlights beautifully that like your approach, what you bring to what you're doing, effort, attentiveness, taking notes, trying to make the thing work no matter what, is so much more important than tripping into this thing that you think is going to lead to a 20% jump in strength.
Well, yeah, it's like Stan Efferding broke that down in his freaking 10-minute talk where he's just like, why was Westside so strong? And he's like, it's not the specifics of the training, it's the environment and the average effort that was brought in that gym and how everybody was pushing each other to push to these high levels of effort. Because, you know, that's something I've always thought was really interesting is the athletes that I coach that succeed are yes, the genetic freaks, right? But they're also the people that come to me and they already know how to work really hard usually, right? And my job is to show them a way to organize their trying really hard that is going to not fuck them up. Because usually people that are just insanely hard workers, someone that comes to mind when just like, I think like heavy-handed training is Andrew House. That guy's training is so rigorous for someone of it just doesn't look in terms of percentages. You'd never guess that's a 1,000-pound squatter and a 900-pound deadlifter. It looks like someone who's like 600, 500 kind of workloads, and he's doing that with that much tonnage. And it's just like, that's some of the most brutally hard training I've ever seen, right? And it's like, what you need, guys who are willing to work really, really hard seem to always know how to drive themselves forward. They just can't figure out how to do it without hurting themselves. And that's the tricky part, right? It's like most of the guys that were going to make it to be really strong had that effort from the beginning. And that's a better dynamic to have as a coach, is I would rather you are chomping at the bit to lift heavy and I tell you, Bromley, no, wait, we're going to do something boring today, right? That's the better dynamic than me trying to coax you into believing you can work really hard and teach you how to work hard. It's like, it can be done, especially if you've got this genetically elite person that needs to work hard. It's like, yeah, eventually you can build them into that person. But a lot of the time, it's just someone who like recklessly throws themselves into sets, gives everything they've got, and then they need to figure out how to organize those sets over time to make it something that's safe and replicatable. But it's like heavy-handed approaches work if they don't hurt you. If you told me I want bigger shoulders, I could just scribble some shit down that I made up and I thought it was stupid. I'm like, 4 days a week, 10 by 10 laterals. Guess what? Your shoulders will get bigger. You might hurt yourself, right? Or if you said, I want bigger legs, or I want my squat to come up. Like, it's like George Lehman's whole program was just throwing the fucking kitchen sink at your deadlift. And it's like, yeah, if you make it through it, your deadlift will go up, right? So it's like these really heavy-handed kitchen sink approaches, they work. Where the intelligence comes in isn't getting them to work, it's getting it to be safe and replicatable, right? And understanding like, hey, some of this stuff isn't necessary, and that's just extra work to recover from that isn't moving the ball forward. Maybe we can understand what parts of that kitchen sink we threw at it were the valuable parts, trim off the fat a little bit so you've got more training economy to be well-rounded. And it's part of why being a single lift specialist is easier, because you can afford to throw everything. Oh, if I've got a wrist exercise I speculate might help my bench, I'll do that. If this back exercise might help, every single thing you suspect might help your bench press, if you have the time to do that, your bench is going to fly. The problem is that you can't kitchen sink multiple lifts at once because you just run into a massive issue of where are we allocating our fatigue, right? But it's like, that's something that I've always thought was really interesting, is like, it's more about bringing huge effort and then being smart enough to direct it, right? And it's like, that's why I'm training with Max this evening for deadlifts, is both of us need stronger hamstrings. So our plan right now is to follow a well-structured deadlifting and squatting program beforehand. We follow different programs because we're different athletes. We need different things. I need to front squat because I'm doing strongman. He needs to do tech work because he's a power lifter. We're going to meet up, and then I'm going to try to kick his ass at hamstrings. He's going to try to kick my ass at hamstrings. We're just going to go kill ourselves on a bunch of hamstring curls and back extensions and hip thrusts. And we're going to limp out of the gym and go eat. And that is the program for the hypertrophy work right now. Obviously, if either of us had a closer proximity to a contest, that would change. But my goal only is just to beat him on every single set. And I don't think I will, but I'm going to try.
Small tidbit on the note of hamstrings. I tried this the other day. I think I got this from Paris. I think the reach stiff leg deadlifts. I don't know if you've ever tried those. I did those 6 days ago. I'm still sore. And it was like 275 for like a couple sets of 10. Anyways, I'm sure you have your favorite exercises. That was one of the worst. I've actually always
done my stiff legs that way because
really?
I'm sure you know it's a little awkward to get into a stiff leg position with short arms with the bar against your shin. It's positionally very weird, right? So it's like I always intuitively like, and I was like really early on, I watched that Ed Cohn video where he talked about starting his stiff legs from out over his toes to make it more mechanically difficult on his like posterior chain. So I was like, okay, this is a valid strategy, but I never even tried doing a stiff leg, keeping it. I've never done an RDL or a stiff leg where I kept it against my shin at the bottom. I've always let it forward because that was just easier position for me to get into, and my hamstrings got sore. So I always was just like, that's how I do it.
So you're ahead. Maybe that's the thing. I mean, I've always practiced. I was focused on bracing, which was my issue. So I was always trying to focus on optimizing leverages on every pulling variation, and practice keeping the bar back, which gets difficult. If you have a long torso, it drifts in front of you kind of easily. So I was always doing RDLs, pushing back and so on.
Yeah, with that long torso, I think I probably overdid it. Whenever I would do RDLs, I would do this way that really like, my hamstrings and my lower back are strong as shit. But I drilled it to the point where it's like I needed to stop doing any RDLs for a while because I was too comfortable letting it out in front of me when it was like mid shin. Like it was almost ingrained. It was almost like an interfering motor pattern, like the same way like weightlifters don't do regular conventional deadlifts because it's just like it rewards this rounded thoracic posture, which we're never using in our sport. It's rewarding something that we don't want to bleed into our lifts. It's like I got so much out of them until it was starting to like reward a poor mechanic of not clamping the weight in tight. Because like you said, with long torso, it's a bitch and a half to keep that thing in close. You need to train the shit out of your lats to have any shot at it.
So to put a bow on all of this, because I want to spend 10 or 15 minutes on this last topic, before, God, if anybody's watching this at this point, God bless you. I fully plan on chopping all this up to, there's so much good stuff that could be on its own video. To put a bow on this, it just seems like the big swings that people can't go wrong with is find something stable and predictable and work hard enough to make it work for you. And then advancing your programming is literally just a matter of making it sustainable by addressing your recovery needs. And every program you do is going to do that in a different way. And it's your job to figure out how that ebb and flow of work and recovery works, because it just seems like it's all just stress, which can be done a million different ways, paired with recovery, which can also find its way in by changing stimulus, dropping the weight a little bit, or dropping the volume, or taking it easy, or doing something different. And that back and forth seems to be universal, and you can apply it to just about damn any program or method of training that you come across. Last topic I would like to bleed into, something for the men, which is 99% of the people watching this anyways. I wanted to take your perspective, because we talked about a couple of things. First of all, you are an authority and an educator, even if you shed that branding. You have an influence over people because not only do you know things to a level that a lot of people in this field don't know, but you're a good speaker, which it almost obligates you. You know what I mean? Like the ability to communicate messages almost obligates you to having a good one to send, because whatever you say, it's going to resonate with people anyways. But you talked about not having any friends, which I relate to. Socialization was very difficult for me. Even now, like I'm 36, I feel like I'm pretty socially competent, but just moving to another state, even going to the gym, even going out to the world, like it's hard to make friends. It's hard to meet people. Like I don't really have friends. I've been in Texas for 2 years. I don't really have friends here. So it's a hard thing for men. Talk a little bit about that. Do you relate to like other people or like the way that men are struggling and the way that people are talking about right now? Have you had some of those obstacles, I guess, in coming into your 20s as a whole man, a whole human being who's capable of existing in society? Like talk about your obstacles and even some of the solutions that you came across, if you found any.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've got as always, a bit of a weird perspective because, like, yeah, it's definitely hard for men to make friends. It seems like I don't know. I'm not a woman. It seems a little easier because my girlfriend has no social skills whatsoever and still finds friends wherever we go.
Yeah.
And but it's never like I've never viewed it as a problem, right? Like when I went through my whole freshman year of college and just didn't make any friends, didn't even register to me that was bad, because I think I've always been like antisocial makes it sound bad. But also, like, I've always been like a pretty antisocial guy, so it's never really registered to me. I think that like you do need to make sure you put yourself into situations where you're interacting with other people, even if you don't talk to them. right? I think that just having that that conscious awareness that other people are perceiving you, I think that's probably pretty necessary, even for me, right? Where it's like, I think that roots our idea of who we are is envisioning how other people perceive us. Because I noticed when it wasn't even during lockdown. This was like last year, totally fine. Montana's super open. And I just like didn't leave my house other than to go to the grocery store ever. I would train, I would eat, I would train, I would eat, I would train, I would eat. And it's weird, right? Because it's like, I think your sense of self goes away a little bit. So it's like, if you're finding yourself in like a very isolated environment, you probably need to go out of your way to just select something where you're around people. You don't even have to talk to them. But it was interesting, right? Because it's like, if everything you think about yourself is relative to other people. I'm short, I'm tall, right? I'm smart, I'm dumb, I'm good looking, I'm bad looking. All of these things aren't objective, they're relative to other people. So I think when you put yourself in, like, there's a reason the social isolation eventually just becomes torture, right? So it's like, I think it just depends on where you're at in life. You probably need to, varying people have varying social needs, right? Like mine are very low, my brothers are a little bit higher, my sisters are very high, right? So it's like, I think you just need to know yourself well enough to know how much exposure to social environments you need to kind of have that as like a staple of your mental health. And you could probably get into a whole argument about, well, you should be comfortable by yourself. And I would say there's probably something to that, but also like we're social beings. We evolved to be social beings. I don't think it's a deficiency to say that I like to be around other people. So you identify like what your social needs are and then come up with like a actionable plan to meet them, whether it's just going to the gym instead of your home gym, whether it's like just doing something, right? It's like Max did that pretty well, where it's like Max likes to be around people a little bit more than I do. So he started like hanging out with some people at the gym, right? Like he was just like, you mind if I tag along to Chipotle, right? And it's just like, as long as you meet whatever your requisite level of sociability is, I think you can be in a good spot. You don't need to go above that and be a social butterfly. If you're very mentally healthy, being a solitary person, awesome. To me, that's less variability. That's less things that like are going to come in out of nowhere and throw off your day, right? It's more predictable if you're someone who's happy being like a little bit more socially isolated. But I don't know if I have a ton of it because I don't think, and I don't interact with people. I think I've got a weird, like I never expected anybody to care about my mental health, right? Like I hear a lot of guys say, nobody cares about mental health of men. And it's like, I didn't know people cared about the mental health of women either. I thought we were all just kind of in it on our own. Like I thought we were all just dealing with it ourselves, right? So it's like, that's not to say, oh, it's the manly thing to do, just fucking suck it up. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying, it's definitely good that people are bringing awareness to it. It just didn't even cross my mind that was something that maybe I should have access to, or like that people should care. Because it's like, I've always kind of felt the perception that like you have, obviously maybe who knows, maybe it's a childhood thing, right? But I'm like, no one is obligated to care about my goals. No one is obligated to care about how much I benched. No one is obligated to care about what I'm doing. Now, I've always thought that if I do something really, really, really heavy, that people will care. So I'm like, I'll try to do something really heavy. Or if I'm a really good person that's a positive influence on the people around me, then they will care. But that's not something that they were like obligated to do. And I don't know. I'm not saying like I am very not versed in this. I don't really like intake any like mental health or men's issues content. So I don't want to come off like I'm some like rah, fuck you, don't have feelings guy. But that's just kind of how I always perceived it. Is like you deal with your problems. And if you're really kind to other people, maybe you're lucky enough that they care about your problems.
Well, you already covered more than most of that content does by addressing the fact that there is a potential system you can use, by the fact that there's different people with different types of needs and it's not universal. I think a lot from like the high, view from space about human beings where they all look like ants, where you think of like the colony is probably better off when you have a more social community, right? As opposed to one that's very isolated and asocial. That doesn't change the fact that there's individuals that will have different tolerances. And yeah, you don't need to go out, like you said, be a social butterfly just because you don't have a lot of friends. And I'm very similar. This is my office, a 400 square foot office. This is bigger than the apartment we lived in before we moved out here. It's somehow my wife let me turn it into my office. It should be a living room. But this is where I live. I only talk to the person that checks me out at the grocery store. And as long as I get some basic interaction, I'm pretty okay. I have things to occupy myself, things to keep me sharp. I think there really is. I mean, one, I think it's like a vitamin that you need. Like being around other people is so good. It's like being out in the sun. And I think that is essential.
I beg to differ. I beg to differ, but I guess it is necessary. I've come to the conclusion it's necessary, but I've always thought of it as a necessary evil because, like,
it might
to,
it might be it might
well,
be
to
a
me,
necessary evil, but I'm saying something that's necessary in the sense that no man is an island. We do form our sense of self, and we do sharpen ourselves, and we do grow in the context of other people. And I think there's a limit to how much somebody can accept. There's fringe people. There's probably some, and they're out in Alaska right now, or maybe parts of Montana, living by themselves, and they're
we
people that
got
are
some
okay.
of those.
Yeah, and but I think that's very much an outlier. I think if you pulled that experiment with most people, results probably wouldn't be great. So,
Yeah.
but that goes back to tweaking it for yourself. What are your needs? Where are you struggling? And the thing that stood out is, like, you talked about, solving problems and coming up with a plan. It's weird because there's stuff on YouTube about, like, running game on women that's directed towards guys that are lonely. There's stuff about becoming an alpha. Hey, here's my Lamborghini or whatever. Here's the house I live in. But none of it. It's like if the only lifting material on YouTube was how to peak for IPF worlds, but there was nothing about what do you do when you're scared and it's your first day at the gym and you've never seen a barbell and you don't know what lifting is. It's like, I feel like a lot of problems could be solved with something as basic as a game plan of, hey, this is how you socialize, because it's getting harder and harder to do that, which it's like asking to tag along to Chipotle. So, I mean, I hear that and I'm like, I can't do that. That's kind of weird. But with dating, with making friends, if you are suffering and you do think you need that exposure, like, yeah, it is something as simple as go where the people are.
Yeah. Yeah. Just you go. You don't even have to, like, that's the thing. Just go. You don't even have to talk. Right.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get some of the benefits just by being there. Right. That's what I do. I don't even talk to people. And I'm like, all right, cool. I got my people have perceived that I exist. I'm not a ghost. Now I can go back to my dog and my computer and go back to programming. But you're right. I think a lot of that stuff is probably skipping the basics. It's like how to date a woman. It's like, bro, you don't know how to talk to people.
Yes.
Like, you do not know how to interact with people. Let's start with that, and that'll really make that next step a lot easier. Like you said, it's like going straight to, like, peaking for worlds. It's like, thankfully in lifting, that's understood, and we have a ton of beginner content, right? But for some reason, social interaction is not organized in levels of complexity and difficulty. And it's like, yes, having a long-term sustainable relationship is pretty complex and difficult, right? Talking to people is less complex and difficult. It's still hard, right? But it's way less complex. You're like, okay, even if I'm awkward, if I come off with a positive demeanor, that's a huge band-aid for maybe not knowing what the perfect thing to say. Like, that's kind of been my girlfriend's strategy, because she really, really lacks, like, fundamental people skills. And just, like, as long as she's a positive person to talk to, that people want to talk to again because it was a positive experience, that's a massive band-aid for all of these little blunders that you might overthink afterwards. You're like, I didn't say the right thing. That's why I just don't talk to people. I'm smooth. It's smooth sailing for me. But she, like, it's a tough spot to be in. I feel for, like, these young dudes where it's like, you fall middle of the bell curve. You require a reasonable amount of social interaction. And for whatever reason, societally, you were put in a position where you weren't getting it. And not only were you not getting it, you never developed the skills to seek it out or to maintain it. So it's like, you have to catch that up to meet this thing that's like a requisite for your mental health being decent, right? But like you said, just fucking go where the people are. Like, just don't eat in your dorm. Eat in the dining hall, even if it's by yourself. And then, but the other thing is, like, I don't know. It's always been tricky for me, because it's like, I am insecure as shit about a ton of things, right? But I don't think I've got, like, low self-esteem, right? I think I got that reversed. I'm not insecure about most things, but I think I have low self-esteem, right?
Oh, okay.
But there's not much, like, I think I'm a pretty cool guy. I'm nice to most of the people. I'm pretty good at my hobbies. I like video games. I'm not embarrassed that I like video games. Like, maybe I'm not the most socially competent person, and people have always known that about me, but it's never been something I was insecure about. It's just a feature, you know? I lost my hair. I look good. I got a good round head. I don't have a weird peanut shaped head. Like, none of these things bother me. Right. Yeah. It's like I was never down on myself, because there's like, yeah, I didn't have a girlfriend for a long, long time because I don't talk to people. But I never felt that was like a fault of mine. Whatever. Like, I said, why would I be embarrassed by that? So it's like, at no point was, like, insecure that my, like, social interaction, I didn't have friends. didn't have a girlfriend. My social interactions were relatively poor, but at no point did I ever see a reason why. Probably I should have been insecure about those things, but it never dawned on me that I should be. That's how it is.
There's this goes back to a lot of what we were talking about earlier when you talked about, you know, chasing your bench goal for the first time, and I related to that heavily because you talked about almost having an unearned confidence. Like, look at that elite world record holder. I could do what he does. I have benefited so much in my life from kind of like an unearned confidence because I relate to what you said. I have very high standards for myself. I'm very, very self-critical, and I am painfully aware of all the things I'm deficient at. But I don't think I've ever really struggled with self-esteem. In fact, I've always had kind of an innate sense that if I wanted to excel at something, including social shit that I sucked at, I could. And now at this point, I'm still not Mr. Rico Suave when I'm out at the club or whatever, or talking to random people, but I'm a pretty effective public speaker. I can chat anybody up on the fly now. Whether or not I enjoy is a different thing, but those skills are there. And it sounds like you've never really had to fear being around other people or had a reason to hesitate. And I think the way we interpret our deficiencies, because you always have to be aware of what is. You know, this is the thing I'm okay at, this is the thing I'm not good at. You have to know what the pieces are at play. But the way you interpret that and the way that stains your perspective of yourself is where all that anxiety seems to come from. And I can only imagine how daunting it is, because I got over a lot of this through my late teens and early 20s. A lot of it through overconsumption of alcohol, admittedly, which wasn't great. But I can only imagine people that are in their late 20s or 30s or later, where it's grown into this daunting thing. And this is what chaps my ass, is just like with lifting, where you have the people at the bottom of the iceberg that should be doing the couple things that give most of your return. You have people at the bottom of the iceberg in this arena that are worried about their jawline, their height. They're worried about whether or not their dick skin shredded. They're worried about whether or not they make $120,000 a year. They're worried about the car they drive, the suits they wear, whatever it is, because that's what the content is. It's not projecting to them, but specifically telling them this is how women will rate you, or this is how the people you interact with will rate you, which is just the garbage thing in the world, because it's like, you can't talk to people. Talk to people and go where they are. You'll be just blown away about how accepting you are.
Well, yeah, it's predatory content based on people who are insecure and cashing in on it, right? Because there's some of that in lifting, right? Luckily, in lifting, I think we have a greater amount of non-predatory, just like, hey, here are the big rocks, just so you know, right? Whereas there's a lot more money to be made off of people's insecurity, right? And it's like, but I think also probably like, if you were to put people on some kind of like neuroticism index, I think that's like one of the biggest predictors for like younger guys that have, because that's something that's been a very odd one for me, because I never fell into any of this, right? Like, it's never been like I've had some issues with like mental health that like, I had no idea what was going on. It just went away eventually, right? I just like, I'll just keep functioning. My environment changed, which is probably why it eventually went away. But I didn't even have the awareness that I didn't know what bad mental health was. So I was just like, man, I feel like shit today. And it's like, I don't have conscious thoughts. So it's just like, I just went through like a very bad 6 months. I was like, yeah, man, fucking shit sucks. And eventually, you know, it passed, right? So I don't have like a ton of familiarity with like the strategies to change your environment and like meds that you could potentially get on to get that ball rolling. I know some of your commenters really don't like meds, but I'm impartial. Like,
yeah, I got a lot of that when I hopped on. Yeah.
But I think part of it is like that neuroticism thing, right? Is like, I think it's weird because I'd probably score like the most neurotic person to ever live on my on everything that goes in my notebook. You know, I weigh like my water is to the milliliter every day. My food is to the gram every day for the last years and years and years and years. It's like my mobility routine, I've like changed, but it's like I haven't skipped a day of mobility in years, right? I haven't skipped a day of training. I do cardio every day. It's like all of these things, I go batshit if the notebook isn't right. But the rest of my life, it's like I was probably score very low on a neuroticism index, which is why I think I probably was never like insecure about any of those things. It is what it is, right? And now it's weird that I'm considered not that young, right? Like, you'll consider me young, but some of my clients, I'm the old guy, which is really, really weird. And it's like, I'm some kind of like positive role model to them. And that's been very odd because I'm a fucking idiot. Like, I don't think. Why would you ask me? And like, why do you care about how I perceive you? You're paying me for good programming. So I care that you perceive I'm a good programmer. But past that, but I'll coach these younger guys. And it's really interesting. I think the same things that lead to people getting really, really spinning their wheels as like a stuck at early intermediate because they're so neurotic, they're always worried they're missing the actual thing. They're changing things rapidly. Those are the same people that like reach out to me and say they're having like these same issues with like, oh, that social interaction was so bad, I'm going to think about it all day. And it's like, I think it relates to neuroticism to some degree, which is like part of why I don't think I have that much experience with it. But my girlfriend's the same way, where it's like, you know, it's like, if you're overthinking, why don't I have a girlfriend? I was like, oh yeah, it's because I've never been in a social interaction. There's the answer. But it's like, if you're really game to overthink something, you're going to go down this rabbit hole of self-reflection, and like, who knows how grounded those self-reflections could be. Or it's like, if you have a social interaction that was a little,
they aren't.
Yeah, it's like, it's like you have a social interaction that was a little clunky. I'll say, man, that was fucking clunky. That was probably their fault, not mine. And I'll go on with my day. Even if it was my fault, I'll assume they were the one that fucked it up. Right. Whereas my girlfriend will come home and say, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. I was like, who fucking cares? Right. But I think it's like this like reflective neurotic nature. And then you apply that to, I also think it's like a very common young man thing to just be generally like mentally semi unwell and attribute that to not having a girlfriend. And it's like, no, that's not it. That's nothing to do with it. That's a funny thing to tack it onto, but it's like it's the same thing as the fucking dudes that think they're going to be super happy when they're strong. And then they get strong and they're still depressed. And it's like, that wasn't it. That was really stupid of you to tack everything onto this one thing that's probably unrelated. It's the same thing with dudes that get a girlfriend. Maybe they get a really pretty girlfriend and they're like, fuck yeah. And they ride their like 2 months out of being over the moon. And then things start to settle down. Things are less exciting and novel. And they get back to just kind of their day-to-day routine. And then they're like, what the fuck? I'm still depressed. Right. I think some people get in that cycle of constantly finding new significant others and just like habitually riding that wave of first 2 months. Oh, the spark is gone. Must be the wrong person. It's like, no. That's just how long-term relationships function. Is like, it's different. Like, unfortunately, you can't just ride that feeling forever. And it's like, some people are so addicted to that feeling and they like recycle it. But I think a lot of the time guys think that, oh, I'm going to put all this into like this general depression I have due to maybe bad habits or my environment not aligning with my internal, right? All of these things. It's just because I don't have a girlfriend. And then I'm going to fucking watch some Andrew Tate videos. I'm going to spit some sick game. I'm going to get some thick baddie, and then I'm going to be happy. And then it doesn't work. And it's like, oh, you misdiagnosed the problem. Like you weren't even like, it's not how you're not barking up the tree wrong. You're barking up the wrong tree to begin with, right? Yeah. Like you probably should get, like, I think there's a lot to that. It's a cliche, but whatever. Like you should probably be mentally healthy by yourself if you ever hope to be in a sustainable, happy relationship. You know, like it's just inevitable codependence. If you're just a miserable fuck while single, you're gonna regress back to that.
I think there's a lot to that. I relate to a lot of people because I went through a lot of this myself. So people that I think do need that minimum amount of socialization, and it's not even just the girlfriend. Usually the guys that can't get the girlfriend probably don't also have a very robust social life to begin with, where they're interacting with different types of people on a regular basis. But I would say somebody like me, who I would say I need a certain amount of socialization, even though it's probably on the low end, when difference between being alone because you enjoy it versus being alone because you don't have the option or feel like you don't have the option. And with those people, the frustration and disillusionment, I think socialization can be an effective way to help mitigate that. But all of these things that we prescribe as being like, well, this is the thing that helps. People think, oh, that's the thing I need to fix my life. And those are two different things. Yeah. You know, it's like, it's compounding. When I was fatter, still a little chubby around the cheeks, but when I was like fat teenager kid, I thought being strong and muscular and big was like the solution to all my problems. But as I got more developed, you realize what it does, which it does a lot of good things. It's a good thing to help your self-esteem. People do talk to you a little bit differently. It gives you an in, exposes you to other people. Nobody has ever solved their mental health by benching 600 pounds, right? No, nobody's ever solved their mental health by winning that bodybuilding show. So it's like something is part of a bigger piece of the puzzle, but it is not in and of itself the cure.
Yeah, and it's like
keeping that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the problem. Like, yeah, getting jacked helps a little bit, and a bunch of things help a little bit. And you should do a little bit of all of them. The problem is that you're not like, it's like, I'm somewhat jacked. I need to get even more jacked, right? No, that's not it, right?
That's
it's like pursuing. Yeah, honestly, pursuing things to their extremes to some degree is inherently mentally unhealthy. Some people tolerate it really well and it gives them purpose in their life and it might be a net positive, but pursuing anything to its extreme is pretty rough. Like my mental health was in the shitter by the end of that 600 bench prep because I was putting so much pressure on myself to do it, and I was eating so much, and I felt like fucking shit all the time. Like it's not good to take things to extreme, and they don't give you the things you want, right? It's the same as lifting. It's like eating the vertical diet isn't going to suddenly make you stand upright, right?
Yeah.
It's no one thing is going to do all that much, right? It's you need to pick the big rocks over, like flip over the big rocks in a couple major domains. Ignore the small rocks in all of those domains until you're in a good spot mentally. Then we could worry about like, hey, I really want to continue pursuing this, right? Now that I'm in a good spot mentally and I'm a reasonably well-rounded-ish person, then I can start saying flipping those small lifting rocks and trying to get real strong. But I've also had the opposite. I had the opposite experience of getting jacked as you did. You were like, it boosted my confidence and something usual talking points, which I think are probably true for most people. Holy shit, I have had the opposite experience. I was skinny and devilishly handsome before I got fat, and I still had hair.
Your body.
Oh, yeah. Dude, people just think I'm like a fucking idiot now. When I'm like checking out the grocery store, I talk to people and they like just assume I'm stupid until proven otherwise. Like it's gotten so far in the other direction. I'm like objectively worse looking. Like it's been all downhill.
I don't know about that, man. I mean, we're often very hard on ourselves. I'm sure people treat you differently, but you were handsome though. I have a face that looks like a defrosted cupcake. So my wife will never let me shave my beard. So when you're that on top of being out of shape and kind of fat, like the fact that I have broad shoulders like changed my life. But that was a very specific thing to me because there is a certain consideration other men give you, and not that it's essential that you have to be the alpha in the room, but when you're insecure, that was something that turned around for me. And one of the reasons that I like putting this lean and I like turning lifting conversations into this is because talking about training is really fun, but I like to get to why people train in the first place because it is so frivolous. And the thing is, I have to be open about this. I don't give a fuck about people that just want to lift for the sake of living, for the sake of lifting, beside from like basic health stuff. But there's a whole identity around lifting that I don't share with people. It's people that are still in their honeymoon stage mostly. Strongman is notorious for this. They get very culty about it. And it's because they're in their honeymoon stage. They tell them it's so cool and they proselytize. Everybody says, we got to grow the sport. We got to grow the sport. I've been around since the sport was non-existent, and I'm not happier because the sport's bigger. Entry fees are more expensive. Novices dominate everything. Every contest has a giant-ass novice division, so there's a lot more chaos going on, less people knowing what's going on. Anyways, long story short, the fact that somebody picks up a keg and carries it around the parking lot doesn't mean anything to me any more than somebody squatting. I really identify with people that found something in this to chip away at that's a little meta to what the lifting actually is. That doesn't mean it has to be a religion or that it had to be your salvation, but I feel like all of this is there's a funny clip from a sitcom that I saw where there's this PE teacher who's kind of doofy. It's like a 1950s era PE teacher with the short shorts, and they're cutting funding, and he's like, they're about to get rid of the PE teacher. He's like, you can't get rid of me. I tire out the boys. Like that's his thing. And I thought about that, and I'm like, that's a really vital thing for a lot of guys and people in general, is to have something physical that you can chip away at, show that you have agency in your life and that you know how to problem solve, and that athletic IQ might be able to translate into other things about you and how you navigate your life. And there's nothing more gratifying than having a goal and believing that you have the basic ability to implement a plan that leads you to that goal. So just as something as simple as that. And there's certainly other things, people treat it like meditation. And it can, again, for me, it didn't change my life because I got jacked, but that specifically for me was the thing I was missing early on. Yeah. So the fact is that weightlifting actually did change my life in a very real way, but it's not because I got strong or competed. Like my life isn't going to be better if I get a pro card, even though I've been that close to it like 9 different times. It's better because of how I approached it. And I think it's really important that people getting into this learn you're probably going to be around longer and do better if you have that fundamental attachment to it beyond just a superficial goal.
Yeah. When I think the other thing is right. Like, it's like, for me, it's like, I've never had, like, I lift weights because I lift weights, right? Like physical training is everything to me. It's always been like, as long as I've lived, school was just waiting to get back to, like, I would run before school. I would wait for school to be over and I would go to boxing, and then I would go to soccer practice. And then I found lifting, and then I would do like an AM session and a PM session. It's just been like waiting to physically train again. And I realized that's not the experience of most. And it's been really interesting to learn about what that relationship is for other people. Because like my girlfriend, right? It's like, she was like, well, like lifting is for her like an avenue for self-improvement, to like get mentally stronger, to address different faults in her like consistency, right? And it's like this great avenue through which she could self-improve. And she like was like, but I feel like there's nothing special about lifting for me, right? It could have been anything. It just happens that you and Max lift weights, right? And I was like, well, that doesn't, it's what was there, right? Like, and you can form the love with, you don't have to be a fucking weirdo like me and just think it's the coolest thing ever the first time you do it. You can form a relationship because of what it, I'm in the gym is meditative, or it's how you, what like the ability to like, if I can get myself to get up and do this 6 out of 10 on squats, I can get myself to do all of these things in my day-to-day life. Like I love what it's done for me. So then you form, you know, that relationship with it in post. It's very interesting, right? But it's like, I like the guys who lift for the sake of lifting to some degree, who did it for a long time. Because I know it sucks that like, oh my God, 10 years in, it's so hard to get better. And it's like that for me, right? It's like I don't even read comments that are positive on my stuff, because it's just it doesn't mean anything. These people aren't real. It's the internet, right? And it's like, nah, I have no worry about it ever going to my head, because I don't think it's real, right? But it really, really means something to me when someone I view as like a peer in how long they've been doing this really seriously says anything nice about me. It makes my fucking week. Like there's a couple like very, very good powerlifters that like follow me on Instagram, and every now and then will say, oh wow, good bench. I'll be like, let's fucking go. You're a weirdo like me. You know how weirdly hard this is, and the fact that we're doing it for no reason. So it's like, that's always been the thing. Like, I don't know how someone can get a big ego off of people that don't know what they're looking at, saying, oh my God, I thought you were going to squat that. And it's like, yeah, a 2-plate overhead press is good, but like, it's not that good. Well, calm down. Like there's people way better. It's the people that know what they're looking at that say that's pretty good, that like means the world to me. But it's interesting, right? Because it's like, I've slowly been branching out of my extreme isolated world of like, everybody I talk to on the internet benches at least 3 plates and is very serious about this, because they're my clients. And it's like, if you found me, you're pretty deep into this, because it's like, I don't advertise. I don't go to the gym in town that often. So it's like, if you found me, you're pretty deep down this rabbit hole of lifting. I've got 5,000 subscribers. It's not very big. And so it's like, and then I like everybody I work with is reasonably advanced. So it's like, I've been slowly figuring out what the fuck, like people's relationship with training is, if it isn't just like a neurotic obsession. And it's been very interesting to me. Right. And like how, oh man, it's so cool that it makes you feel empowered about your body, or like it does all this good stuff for you. I never even thought of that. I just like lifting heavy stuff. I'm glad it does that for you. Like we can talk about our shared hobby, even if we do it for different reasons.
Well, it's okay. So, as a brief question, like to dig into that. So, imagine you never stumbled into physical training. Do you imagine that there's something unique about lifting, or do you feel like you just would have taken this attention, this focus, this weirdo-ness, and just applied it in another arena with just as much exuberance?
I don't think so. Like nothing nothing else has clicked in that way, right? It's like I'm like you. Like I have some confidence that if I really put my mind to it, my YouTube channel would be really big. I just haven't put my mind to it, but I'm confident that if I did, it would be big, right? It's like all these things, right? But the thing is, I know that I need to be genuinely interested in something to pursue it with any interest at all, right? Like I made it through school. Like thankfully I was a good test taker, and that just carried me through school. But I've never been like, it's only things I'm interested. I don't make jack shit for money. I'm poor as shit. Like I live in the middle of nowhere, Three Forks, Montana, and there's no sign of that changing anytime soon. And it's just like I put my eggs into the baskets of things I find interesting, and physical training is just the only thing that's really like, I'm like, man, that's fucking interesting. I want to do something really. So I can't even imagine if I didn't stumble into some kind of physical training. I feel like I would have gone for a run, and like maybe I could have gotten into running, because it's hard. I want to do something hard and physical and be better than other people at it. Right. It's just like, there's so much about it that I really like that just like clicked with me immediately. And I'm just like, this is my shit. And this actually interests me. And then every other part of my life is like, yeah, I'll be proficient. So I'm not like homeless. I'll put in whatever level of like, thankfully, like I said, I'm pretty adaptable. I always did really good in school. So it's like, I didn't have to put that much effort in to get through college with a good GPA, because I thought I was going to be a physical therapist. And like, you need a 3.7 or higher to go to physical therapy school. So just did exactly what I needed to do to maintain a 3.7, and that was that. And like, but nothing else really strikes my interest in that way at all. Right. And it's like, it seems to be unique to physical training. There's a couple modalities of physical training I could, like, if I had stayed in combat sports, I think I would be equally obsessive and happy, because I really like combat sports. And that's something that, like, I just really enjoy, that I've had to, like, kind of, that's the only thing I've sacrificed, to me. Like, I've taken a couple years off my life. I got no friends, don't leave my house. None of those things feel like sacrifices because they're not interesting to me. Like, never drank alcohol. I didn't drink alcohol because I didn't want to, not because it was some sacrifice I thought I was making. It just never even crossed my mind. Right. The only thing that I feel like I'm sacrificing is the ability to pursue combat sports to a high level as well. Because he who chases two rabbits catches neither.
It's true story. My takeaway from that is that, and I'm the same way. I relate to that very much, in that I can't fake interest. I can force myself to get competent at something. I'm good at cramming. Like, I can get caffeinated, sit down and cram for any test. I worked at Yard House when I was working in restaurants for a while. And at the time they made you memorize like 97 food items and every ingredient that went in. And I literally went to Starbucks and sat there for 8 hours and memorized food ingredients. But then they started losing people because nobody did that shit. And then, like, okay, we got to load of sales. Anyways, but yeah, as far as something I'm going to do long term, even once I got that job, I sucked at serving because I never paid attention to the updates on the beer tap. I didn't care about the fish of the week. It's like, I'm here for a paycheck. I can't make myself love things I don't. So I think I'm probably giving more credit to myself that I got into lifting to specifically solve some existential crisis or make my life better. It probably was that I liked it for a reason that is kind of arbitrary, and it happened to fit certain things in my life. And I think if there is a lesson to take from that, it's like, it's okay to pursue the things you absolutely love. There's this good financial advice I got a long time ago that was, it's not a problem to spend a lot of money on something. It's a problem to spend a lot of money on everything. Find the thing that you love more than anything. That's the thing you dedicate money to. And if you're fine living at the bottom rung everywhere else, like that's your life. Same thing with where you put your eggs for effort and attention, whatever. So find what you love to do that makes you excited. But I think no matter what you do, you can always reverse engineer a reason that your life is a little bit better for it. Because I think fundamentally everybody has to be moving towards something, or else they're just kind of atrophying and falling apart. And that's, I don't know. Hopefully, I think that's something that people can walk away with. That there isn't some it thing out there. There's what you engage with it. Just the way that you engage with it is a way that I think can have a lot of return. Because in all honesty, there's millions of people lifting weights. There are virtually nobody who is setting world records or lifting at the upper echelon. So you have to find enjoyment and purpose in what you do, that can sustain it, that gives some kind of meaning for it.
Yeah, I think people get really dicey looking for something that's going to be that perfect fit, and they're just like, oh, it's going to click. And it's like, that thing for 99% of people doesn't seem to exist. You need to find something that's good enough, and then you conform to that thing and ride it for everything it's worth.
I know the addictive personality types who their life was a fucking wreck, but they were talented athletes. And because they got for the first time in their life validation from anybody for like getting into a strength sport, they're like living in their car, they have kids they haven't seen or whatever, but they're like, I'm going to get that state record. And it becomes toxic when you associate this arbitrary goal. It's like the process of engaging with that has to do something on a deeper level. I want to wrap this whole thing up. I'm going to get a little like hallmark here for a second. Last bits of wisdom from Sam Shethar. I'm going to ask you a deep question. I want you to think about it for a minute. If you're at the very end of your life, you're on your deathbed, what are 3 things that you want to be able to say that you did that will lead you to feel satisfied? Like, life was worth it. I got those 3 things.
I was really strong. I think I could probably be somewhat happy if that's all I could say. I look back, I was like, damn, I was really strong. If I could say that, I'll be pretty happy. I would be very happy if I could look back and say, in addition to being just the strongest human to ever live, I was a pretty good boyfriend / husband and brother. Right, because I really care about Kirsten and Max, the 2 people that live with me, my brother and my girlfriend. We've been together for like 5 years, so it's like I don't need to like necessarily say, oh, I impacted hundreds of people and enabled them through fitness. There's other people that are really competent, that are great communicators, that are doing that for me. That's going to happen. I know. I don't think I'm filling some void that wouldn't happen without me. They need me as a positive influence. I don't necessarily think that. Yeah, I don't know if I could look back and I could say, damn, I got really strong. It worked, right? Because it's like, I found a video of Dan Green. I'm like, yeah, I'm spending the next 30 years getting like this. That sounds pretty good to me. So if I'm like, I look back, I did that pretty good. I was kind to the people around me. So I wasn't a dickheaded, just like a net negative on society while I did it. Because it's like, yeah, that's my goal is to pursue that thing, but I don't want to burden other people with me being a fucking jackass while I do it. So yeah, positive influence around and the people around me, really strong. I don't even need a third one.
I mean, you could probably break those into 10, but they encompass so much. It's simple. You got your personal achievements for the one thing you care about, your relationship with the people that are close to you, not being a drain on society. I think that's a very admirable and very attainable list. Well, at least
let me give you my delusional. I'm young and I think I understand anything take. I think that people need to understand that, like, you can find meaning in a bunch of things. I think it's good that people are realizing that, like, you know, getting married and having kids works for a lot of people. You shouldn't think you're always unique and that's not going to work for you, and you find a tremendous amount of meaning in it. But not everybody is going to find meaning in that. And just like on some like Book of Five Rings type shit, some people are going to find lifelong meaning in the pursuit of a craft and understanding it better and doing it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. Just be open-minded to what actually is going to work for you. Don't be tied to something because it sounds cool. But yeah, no, so far in life, just the idea of pursuing a craft to its highest degree gives me plenty of fulfillment.
There's a guy I follow. I started listening to a channel that's basically just his shower thoughts. He started a second channel. And anyways, he was talking about being ambitious, and he was describing himself as not ambitious, even though he has a YouTube channel with several million subs and he's very well known and makes a ton of money and is able to have a balanced life because he also has this huge recreational time where he can do whatever he wants. Anyways, and he's like, I'm not very ambitious. He's like, people are trying to shoot for the moon and become billionaires and do this, that, and the other thing. And he's like, I just want to do the thing I've been doing, get better at that, and then keep doing that thing. And I'm like, that's what ambition should be. That's what should be in the self-help books, because anybody can dig into a craft, find pleasure in doing it, and get so much better than if they never would have done it, that it not only is gratifying for them, but offers value to the people around them, whether they went out seeking that or not. But I think that's about as good as it can get. It's like the things that I preach to people that I think are important, get down to the brass tacks. It's like, find some purpose, do something that makes you feel motivated to do something for the sake of it. And then the rest is just your attachment to community and potentially a significant other, or at least in the form of close friends. And if you can do that, I think it's hard to go wrong. So I'm going to end it on that note because, man, we got in the weeds. It was a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate you being here and doing this with me. Where can people find you?
My Instagram is @Shethar, just my last name, Shethar. And my YouTube is Shethar Training, spelled the same. That's it's about the only places you'll find me. Yeah.
And check it out, because his YouTube is filled with not only crazy feats of strength, but really in-depth discussion about the way he thinks about training, how he's addressing problems. It's very bare bones, straight to the point. So I strongly recommend you check that out. Thank you, Sam, for being with me today. Until next time, guys, this is Bromley. I'll see you.